Hello, everyone. My name is Robert Carrillo, and I am your host for the Cancer Doctor podcast. Today in studio, I have Dr. Linda Isaacs in studio. She's a medical doctor and a graduate of Vanderbilt University School of Medicine, and she's certified by the American Board of Internal Medicine. She offers individualized nutritional protocols for patients with cancer and other illnesses, as well as protocols for health and maintenance. But pay close attention to today's discussion because it's a very important discussion for this reason. Dr. Linda Isaacs is the only living authority that can speak regarding this unique protocol for cancer patients, which has existed and evolved over the last 100 years. So it's going to be a very interesting discussion. Get your pen and paper out. I think you may want to take a note regarding our discussion today. Dr. Linda Isaacs, thank you for coming here into the studio. It's a pleasure to have you.
Well, thank you so much for inviting me. I'm happy to be here.
Dr. Linda, here's the first question that I'm going to ask you that everyone likes to find out at the beginning. How long have you been a medical doctor for? And how long have you been treating patients with cancer with this unique protocol that we'll get into?
Well, I graduated from medical school in 1985, and I started utilizing this work with patients directly myself in 1993.
Okay, so it's been over 30 years.
That's right. It's been over 30 years.
In over 30 years of time, if you were just taking just a wild guesstimate, how many patients do you think you've served over that time?
I really don't know. I can't answer that because, sometimes people assume that means thousands and thousands of people. But in fact, what I do is fairly low volume because I spend a lot of time explaining things to people and answering phone calls from people. So it's not thousands, but it's certainly a lot. So I really can't put my thumb on exactly how many.
Fair enough. As a physician, what is it that surprises you about the patients that you serve?
What surprises me, I would say, is their resilience and their courage. The people that I see, they're very motivated. They frequently come to me with suggestions and ideas and things that I hadn't heard of. I'm grateful that they come to me rather than simply implementing, because sometimes what they come up with I don't agree with and can explain why. But overall, just their intelligence, their courage. And just how resilient people really can be.
Yeah, I've definitely seen that as well, and I'm glad you bring this up because we mention this on every podcast, but we'll mention it again. Please don't doctor yourself. Get a physician, get a professional to provide you the guidance that you need on your health journey, especially if you're facing a health crisis like a cancer diagnosis. So thanks for mentioning that. It reminded me to cue that in. One of the things that I've wanted to discuss with you regarding the protocol and that you provide to patients, and we'll go through all of it and we'll take our time and we'll unpack it for the layperson, but the autonomic nervous system. As we dive right into this, I want to dive right into a topic that can get a little heady, I guess, for some of us. But the autonomic nervous system is something that the protocol that you administer focuses in on. Can you explain for the layperson what is that, and how does knowing about it and working, I guess, within it help improve your health, or in this case, if you're a patient with cancer, how can it improve it? Help us understand this a little bit.
Sure. Well, the autonomic nervous system is the nervous system in our body that controls the things that we don't consciously think about. As an example, if you want to move your arm, well, then you think about it and your arm moves. But with the autonomic nervous system, it's controlling things like our digestion, our heart rate, our blood pressure. And so we're not consciously controlling it, but nonetheless, there's a nervous system that manages it, and that's the autonomic nervous system. So it has two parts, the sympathetic and the parasympathetic. The sympathetic is in charge of the fight or flight response, so things that help you get out of the way if you look up and you're about to get hit by a bus. So the sympathetic system will make your heart go faster and it will raise your blood pressure so you can get out of the way very quickly, get out of the way of that bus that's coming at you. But the sympathetic system will shut down your digestion because if you're about to get hit by a bus, digesting your lunch really doesn't matter. It can wait.
Mm.
The parasympathetic system is in charge of the rest, digest, repair types of systems. So when the parasympathetic system fires, it will tend to drop your heart rate and lower your blood pressure because you're resting, but it will speed up your digestion because you're resting and digesting. It also tends to stimulate the immune system.
Hmm.
And so the parasympathetic system has a very different set of functions, and the two systems work in opposition to one another. So one of them raises your heart rate, the other one lowers your heart rate. And that gives your body the ability to adjust your metabolism depending on what the needs of the hour are. So that's the autonomic nervous system.
It sounds similar to me, uh, like the way pH works in the body. I guess, I've heard that our pH tries to stay at 7.0, going acidic or alkaline. You hear
Hmm.
these things and that the system is doing a little tug of war to get us right in the middle.
Hmm.
Is that what the autonomic nervous system's doing between the parasympathetic and the sympathetic? It's just kind of a friendly tug of war to keep us in balance?
Well, ideally, the autonomic nervous system is creating, as you said, a tug of war to keep us in balance. The trouble is that sometimes that set point is a little off. It can be too much to one side or too much of the other. And there's actually a correlation with pH, with acid alkaline, because people with an overactive sympathetic system tend to be more on the acid side. And people with the overactive parasympathetic system tend to be a little bit more on the alkaline side of optimal pH, which is actually a little more alkaline than what you described, just for the science nerds among us.
Okay. Um, I like the science nerds. I like the
Mhm.
nerdy stuff. On a day-to-day basis, as we're living our life, um, are there things that we can consciously do as individuals to bring ourselves in balance? Is this a lifestyle thing? Like when I hear about sympathetic, I think fight or flight, right? I think
Mhm.
I think stress is what I think. I think high
Mhm.
stress, a lot of cortisol in the body. And obviously walking around like that for hours and hours out of the day would not be healthy, right? I would presume you don't want to be in that fight or flight state. Are there things that an individual can do, practically speaking, to calm down the sympathetic system?
Yes, I mean, some of the things for those with an overactive sympathetic system, some of the things that can help balance that out a bit. One would be diet,
Mhm.
because leafy greens or citrus foods can actually make the body a little more alkaline and tone down the overactive sympathetic system. Exercise can be very beneficial. And some of the supplements, like magnesium, especially, it's actually been documented that a low magnesium can make an animal have an overactive sympathetic system.
Hmm.
So many people supposedly are magnesium deficient, and magnesium can help tone down that overactive sympathetic system for those who are in that place.
Okay. So food, exercise, supplements, as an example, would be one way to tone down that sympathetic system. So explain to me, and I want to, go right to cancer. When it comes to the autonomic nervous system, if it's out of balance, how is it that this would influence a cancer to grow in the body? What is the theory behind this, I guess?
Well, the what we find on a practical level is that people with an overactive sympathetic system, if they're going to develop a cancer, it will typically be one of what we call solid cancers, or carcinomas would be the technical name that you'd see on the pathology report. But it's cancers like lung cancer, colon cancer, prostate cancer, breast cancer, all of those fit into the category of carcinomas.
Hmm.
And so people with an overactive sympathetic system will usually develop one of those types of cancers. People, on the other hand, with an overactive parasympathetic system, you might remember that I mentioned that the parasympathetic system can stimulate the immune system,
Hmm.
and they're likely to develop the types of cancers that come from an overstimulated immune system. So that would be things like leukemias, lymphomas, myelomas. Many times, melanoma, that's a skin cancer, will fit into that category as well. So what we believe in the work that I do is that that different types of cancer require a different approach. So carcinomas will fall into one camp, but the immune cancers will fall into a different camp and need a different kind of diet to help those people function at their best.
Okay. So I wanna restate this or recap it. So when you see a patient that has a cancer diagnosis, what you have found is that the solid tumors that a person has, those are generally associated with the sympathetic nervous system being
Right.
overly active, I presume, overly
Yes.
active. And if it's a blood cancer or sarcomas or a skin cancer, it's driven by the parasympathetic system being overly active in that regard.
Yes, with melanoma is a specific type of skin cancer, and with the cancers of the immune system or the cancers of sarcoma, which is a cancer of a muscle cell,
Mm.
typically those people fall into a more that their metabolism is more parasympathetic. The difference in diet comes down to that the parasympathetic people need a lot of meat in their diet, whereas the sympathetics, the people that have an overactive sympathetic system, will do better with vegetables and grains, basically.
Yeah, it's fascinating because this topic is of the autonomic nervous system is fascinating because I have participated in some ultra events and some endurance events, and some of the participants have told me that once the event is all done, they get sick.
Hmm.
They're just they crash in essence, right? It's very few that don't crash.
Hmm.
If this is the case with the autonomic nervous system, and I am thinking now about the parasympathetic, which you said is our rest and repair, but it also is turning on the immune system. How does a person, I guess, and I'm just thinking of this as a layperson, but how can you over rest? I always think of rest as being a positive thing, like it can't hurt you. Like if you got a lot of rest, and how does that turn into something where your immune system just kind of kicks on high and betrays you, I guess, and
Hmm.
you end up getting a disease? It just seems counterintuitive to me. I would think like that's the best place to be. It's like no stress, relax, take
Hmm.
your naps. Explain that to me. How does this happen?
That's a tough question to answer because all I can really say is it just does. But if you think about autoimmune diseases, which
Mm.
are currently, some people consider them to be rather rampant in our society.
Mhm.
People who are, exhausted all the time, their thyroid doesn't work, their
Mm.
adrenals aren't working properly. Um, in effect, their immune system is over revved and is attacking the self. That's what an autoimmune disease is.
Okay.
And so there's a fair amount of that is actually going on. Um, so so yeah, the immune system can be overactive.
Interesting. Is it possible, Dr. Isaacs, for someone to be in a high state of sympathetic, okay, to be on the sympathetic side, which is the fight or flight, to be at that place for a long period of time, and then the parasympathetic system, which is the repair, kicks on like in a really aggressive way to try to fix this and bring it back into working order? Is that possible? Does that happen?
Um, I think this is all getting into fairly complicated areas. It's hard to distill
Hmm.
because it would be different for different people.
Okay.
Part of the issue is that while I talk about cancer and I talk about people being in one extreme or the other,
Hmm.
in fact, the bulk of the population is more in the middle, more balanced.
Okay.
And so the what that can mean is that those people that are more balanced, if they follow an extreme type of diet,
Hmm.
that can start shifting their metabolism back and forth across the
Mm.
balance point in a way that can create some of the situations that you're describing. But
Interesting.
it gets a little bit more complicated when you're talking about illnesses other than cancer.
Got it. Interesting. Interesting. So you can have a perfectly healthy person, well balanced life, but then they maybe even just with food start eating a particular way and kicks them
Mhm.
over to the other side. It's just fascinating. Um,
Yeah, and part of the problem, from my point of view, is that people don't always listen to their bodies. Instead, they read a book or they hear a podcast or something inspires them to do an extreme diet of one kind or another.
mhm.
Well, if, using my left hand for the sympathetic and my right hand for the parasympathetic, so if somebody starts off as balanced and then they decide that they're going to go on a vegan diet,
Hmm.
that will shift their metabolism over to that parasympathetic side. So what will happen is they'll start feeling more tired. They feel like they want to rest more. Their immune system kicks in, and they've suddenly got allergies where they never had allergies before, and they just don't feel well.
Mm.
So then they read another book and they hear about maybe the Atkins diet or the paleo diet,
Mm.
and they start eating that, and their metabolism shifts toward the middle, and they're feeling better, and it's all great. And then they keep going, and now they're too sympathetic, and their family says, "You're so irritable, you're so hyper. What has gotten into you?"
Okay.
And they don't feel well, they're twitchy, and they're saying, "What do I eat?" And the answer for that individual is you need to eat a variety of foods. And there may be a day that you want a steak, and there may be another day that you want to eat nothing but vegetables. Listen to your body. But that's not the message that's being sold because that doesn't sell books. And what sells books? A definitive line everyone should eat like this.
It's just so fascinating because all of us eat every day.
Mm.
So we have to eat. And the just the thought that what I'm putting into my mouth can influence my autonomic nervous system is incredible to me.
Mhm.
But then when what you just stated, we're marketed to heavily in health and wellness. I mean, there's always books or podcasts, and someone is saying this is the way to eat, and you're correct. I've been guilty of such things. I've read things. Well, this sounds reasonable to me. I'm going to start consuming this or eating this way, and you get excited about it. But having never known about the autonomic nervous system and how that could be influenced, I'm like, well, wait a second. This is a new thing. I need to incorporate into my thought process
Mhm.
in regards to food. So again, when you receive a patient that has a diagnosis of cancer, is the autonomic nervous system one of the first things that you're looking at when you start assessing that patient?
Well, generally, as I said, the cancer patients, for the most part, fall into one category or the other.
Hmm.
So actually, just talking, knowing what kind of diagnosis they have, I already know where they're going to be at.
Okay.
But the people with the carcinomas typically have the overactive sympathetic system, and those are the people that I would put on a more, not 100% vegetarian diet, but a diet that would be focusing on vegetables, fruits, grains, leafy greens, those types of things. And what animal protein was there would be things like eggs and dairy and fish. Whereas the people with the immune cancers, again, my experience tells me that they feel better if they're eating meat sometimes 3 times a day.
Mm.
Like for instance, I have a patient with myeloma. That's a disease of the immune system, and she does not feel well unless she eats red meat daily. And she tends, one of the things that can happen with myeloma is leaking protein in the urine. And she can tell because her urine will look like beer, it gets a foam on it.
Interesting.
So if she doesn't eat red meat consistently, she'll get foamy urine. And if she starts eating it, if she eats it as she should, then it's fine. So she can tell, just
Fascinating.
she gets feedback, if she observes what's going on,
Mhm.
she gets feedback from just how her body reacts.
Who is the pioneer that did a lot of work with the autonomic nervous system? Who gets the credit for this? Who discovered it?
Um, Well, I'm a very literal-minded person, and so literal-minded would tell me to tell you the name Langley, who was the scientist who first described the autonomic nervous system and the two parts of it in more detail. I mean, the general anatomic structures had been known like forever,
Okay.
but in terms of what they were doing, Langley is the one that's given the bulk of the credit for that. But as soon as he started describing the two parts of the autonomic nervous system, people started speculating about whether there were some people that had an overactive sympathetic, fight or flight response, and other people that had an overactive rest and digest. Partly because, if you just look around, you can see some people that are twitchy and irritable and
Mm-hmm.
just seem to have a hard time holding still,
Mm-hmm.
and another group of people that is very easygoing and laid back and they want to eat a steak. Um,
Mm-hmm.
so you can kind of see it just looking around. And so various doctors started talking about this even in the 1910s, 1920s. And there were some seminal work that was done before World War II. But it all seems to have kind of disappeared for the most part after World War II,
Mm.
partly because pharmaceuticals came around. And at that point, I think people started looking for and expecting a quick fix to things as opposed to, something slower. Because, if I tell somebody with an overactive sympathetic system to eat lots of veggies, well, that's not going to fix it. What's going on by next Tuesday? It's going
Mm-hmm.
to take longer than that. People wanted something that would work quicker.
Mm.
So, a lot of this line of work has kind of been pushed to the back burner, with the exception of the person that I learned a lot of this from would be William Donald Kelley,
Mm-hmm.
because he's an orthodontist who started treating cancer in the 1960s.
Mm-hmm.
From 1960 through, he was mainly active from the mid 60s until the mid 80s. But he utilized all of this theory in his work.
Mm-hmm.
So he's kept this alive. And then Dr. Nicholas Gonzalez and myself have continued to utilize these principles.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Okay. So there are a lot of diets out there for cancer patients. Patients with cancer they're told a lot of things.
Mhm.
Right now, the hot one is a keto diet. You hear a lot about that every patient with cancer should be on a keto diet. There's the Ornish diet, right?
Mhm.
Let's go plants, and more plants.
Right.
Mediterranean diets, Atkins diet, you mentioned your carnivore diets. There's just so much.
Right.
There's just so much going on there. And obviously in your practice, as you mentioned, when they already come in with a diagnosis, you already know, okay, parasympathetic or sympathetic, and that's going to guide you. And this has been a part of your work for over 3 decades. It's not a one size fits all
Mhm.
when it comes to the food. Why is it that different people in the world have different diets, and some of them don't get cancer, I guess, and
Mhm.
maybe some of them do, because we think of it, we think really like with this Western mindset. Well, this is how we do it in the US, for example. But Eskimos eat differently. And there's some people in other parts of the world that they just eat completely differently than we do, right?
Mhm.
And they don't get some of the diseases that we do, which I just kind of So I don't know what to make of it sometimes.
Hmm.
But what do you make of it as a physician, as someone that's working with people that have gotten a cancer diagnosis when it comes to the diet part?
Hmm. All right. Well, for one thing, our diets in America, the standard American diet, or the SAD diet, as it's known in the health-oriented world, is very far removed from what people ate 200 years ago.
Mm,
So, we're eating a diet that involves a lot of processed foods, a lot of foods that's missing the nutrients just because of the way it's grown or farmed. And so we're not really eating the diets that our bodies were made to use,
mm,
in effect. And
mm,
so that can cause some problems. And then we have a wide variety of choices as well.
mm,
If you think about it, my grandparents, my great grandparents, they only had what they could raise. They only had what was in the area. They had local food, but we can eat whatever we want because it can be, flown in from Chile, off season fruits and vegetables and all sorts of stuff. Which all that variety is wonderful, but it can also mean that we'll choose to eat food that really isn't the best for our metabolism. Now, some of the reasons why people might genetically, biologically need different types of food could come from where were their ancestors.
mm,
So if you think about the type of diet that works well, like the sympathetic dominant, who does well with a diet that's more based on fruits and vegetables and grains and nuts and seeds and etc. And they would eat eggs and they would eat dairy, but they would only eat that chicken or the cow when it stopped producing. So
mm,
animal protein would not be a huge part of their diet. So who does best in a farm environment? That's what I'm describing. A person with a slightly overactive sympathetic system. The opposite extreme would be the people that need a lot of meat. They're more of the hunter-gatherer types. So, just as an example, one of the patients in the practice who's the most carnivorous one we have, she got one of those genetic tests to see where her ancestors were from.
mm,
70% of them, she told me, were from north of the Arctic Circle, and the rest of them were from high mountainous areas. Neither of those locations is really good for farming.
mhm,
So the type of food they would eat is more hunter-gatherer. So there would be the animal protein, and she eats a lot of it, and
mm,
she doesn't feel well if she doesn't eat it.
mm,
And she also eats a lot of the root vegetables, those types of things that you would gather as a hunter-gatherer.
mhm,
So that's the diet that works well for her.
mhm,
If she eats a lot of leafy greens, she feels like she didn't eat anything, and it's
mhm,
not good for her body chemistry. She doesn't feel well eating like that.
mhm,
So, part of why there's a mismatch between our diet and our metabolism is, for one thing, because we have such a wide variety of things readily available at the
mhm,
supermarket.
mhm,
And for another, that food is no longer the same as the food that was available 200 years ago.
mhm,
It's been processed, it's been genetically modified to have more sugar, to have all the things that make our taste buds happy
mhm,
but don't necessarily work well for our metabolism.
mhm. It sounds to me like variety and the ease of accessibility is killing us when it comes to food. It doesn't
Well,
seem to have helped us, Dr. Isaacs.
well, I think all those things are, they certainly make life more interesting and all that, but
Right.
it does require a little more thought
Mm.
in terms of what we do to take care of ourselves.
Do you think that it's in the public, just speaking about the public in general, that it's in the public's best interest to really get their food locally, if it's locally farmed or even if it's cattle, for beef, to go local and to try to stay more local?
Uh, well, I certainly think there's a lot to be said for eating locally, just in terms of the environment as a whole,
Hmm.
because it doesn't require all the shipping and all the processing and et cetera, just to keep it fresh until it gets to us.
Hmm.
And I'm all for supporting local farmers as much as a person can.
Hmm. Yeah, it's interesting what you said about just the way our ancestors used to eat and things were not readily available. I can still remember my grandmother when I was a little boy. She wouldn't eat things out of a box because the expiration date was so far. Like she was like, "That's not real. You shouldn't eat that. There's something wrong with that because it should spoil." Is what she was communicating to me, and it's just one of those childhood memories that I have about her talking about food. But I do remember growing up and eating like real food, not things that were necessarily, we were not eating out of a box a lot, when I was growing up. My mom was cooking and stuff and real food. So this, food is a fascinating topic. I mean, because we all love to eat. We love tasty foods, but there's such a variety and everybody is marketing to us. This food's better than the other food. But here I have you in studio and you're bringing something so important to the table that, hey, if you have a particular type of cancer, you should probably be eating this type of diet. You will benefit from it. In your practice, when you put the patient on the particular diet that is individualized for them, is it about a 2 or 3 month wait time before they start feeling maybe some of the therapeutic effects of just the diet itself? Because obviously it's not a pill, it's not a pharmaceutical, it's not a quick fix. Is it a 2 to 3 month period of time? What does that look like?
Well, in terms of how they feel on the diet or what they think of the diet, what I can say there is that most of the time, the people with the overactive sympathetic system that need the fruits and grains and et cetera, most of the time, I will go through the diet and they'll say, honestly, that's pretty much what I've been doing. It's pretty much what my body steered me towards. So I hear that a fair amount. And with the carnivores, of course, the advice to cancer patients has veered over the years. So back in the 90s, 2000s, everybody was told to eat a vegetarian type diet, and the carnivores would have been trying that. The people with the overactive parasympathetic system, like the lymphoma patients, those types of folks, and they are so happy when they're told to eat meat. They would look at me and say, "I've been dreaming about it. I've been dreaming about steak." And they're just so happy. And
Wow.
meanwhile, I myself am more on the sympathetic dominant side, not extremely so, but I don't do well with a ton of red meat. And so explaining that diet is difficult for me because I'm saying, eat red meat every day, twice a day if you want. And they're so happy. And I'm like, oh my gosh, if I ate like that, I'd get so sick. So it's part of the reason why many practitioners don't think like this, because we as people, I think, are very inclined to say, if it works for me, it's going to work for everybody. And we're very promotional about it. But that doesn't work because different people are different.
I really respect you for saying that because, we do have our biases and we're like, no, this is the only way to go. I have my biases too, but to imagine that you've been doing what you've been doing now for over 30 years and having to communicate, recommend a diet at times. It's not like, it's not for you, for yourself. You're like, this isn't how I eat, but you really believe that this is going to be the best thing for the patient to do in this situation. You should begin to, change your diet and begin eating this way. That's a breath of fresh air compared to a lot of the things that patients hear out there. Can you talk to us a little bit about, because this does entail diet and the way it changes as the ability to change our health and our wellness. Weston Price, he was a dentist. I would like you to tell our audience about him, who he is, what made him special, and what some of his basic discoveries were when it comes to the area of diet itself.
Yes, well, Weston Price was a dentist who had an interest in nutrition, and he I don't remember exactly what his life's, when he lived and passed away, but he traveled the world in the early parts of the 1900s, so 1910s, 20s, 30s, along in there, And what he was looking for was, first of all, what people were eating in different areas of the world. And secondly, what happened to their health when they started to eat the foods of, so-called Western civilization. So that would be the canned foods, the processed foods, all the stuff that colonialists had brought with them to eat, that the local people would then decide, okay, I'm going to eat like that too. He was observing what happened to their health. And so what he found was, first of all, that there were a wide variety of diets out there, because humans will pretty much eat whatever they can in whatever location.
Right.
So in some places there was a lot of different types of vegetation, but in other places there was nothing but meat. And so he was looking to see what people were eating and what happened to their health when they changed it and started eating processed food. So what he found was that, first of all, the people that continued to eat their indigenous diets lived a long time and were very, very healthy. And secondly, that as people changed their diet, their own health deteriorated, and the health of their children definitely deteriorated. So, now we have what I would say is an epidemic of kids needing braces, for example. I needed them myself. But what Price observed was that if people were still eating their indigenous diet, they had beautiful teeth. But the diets of the children and the grandchildren of those who started changing their diet, their teeth were a mess. And so there's some extremely impressive photos of what he found as he traveled the world. And, a lot of this research, it would be impossible to do today, because the influence of the convenience of all this prepackaged food, food that you don't have to go out and hunt it. You don't have to go out and dig it up. You don't have to pound it to make it palatable and cook it for hours. All of this convenient food has messed up our health. That's really what reading Price's book would tell you. And this book was published, almost 100 years ago. And yet the things that Price figured out are still being put forth in the news as some amazing new discovery of modern science. Processed food is bad for us. And, anyone that's read Price is saying, hello, this is something we already knew.
Yeah. I have his book, Weston Price. And he was a dentist, right? That's what his forte was. He was a dentist, but the pictures in the book that are there of the teeth of children, young people, those that were eating what I would call their native diet, their teeth were perfectly straight. Nothing was wrong with their teeth. And it made me, the first time I read it, I was like, how do these kids their teeth just grew out straight? They're fine. And then the other children that are eating the Western diet, it is amazing how destroyed their teeth are.
Right.
Their dental health was absolutely wrecked. I remember the first time when I read that material, I was like, well, we're hurting our own kids in the U.S. by feeding them all this stuff, and their teeth don't come out straight. I'm wondering now, like, if we just gave them like real food or, just give them stuff that's cooked, maybe their teeth will just come out straight. They won't need braces. And it's so fascinating because if it's affecting oral health like that, how is it affecting the inside of my body? It just causes me to go, wow. I'm speaking for myself. I just think convenience is our enemy. I think we need to get back to cooking our own meals, putting in the work, putting in the time. And but we live in such a rush society. And I had read something, it was within the last year, I think. It was 80 million Americans eat fast food every day. 80 million Americans. I'm like, I can't even get my head around that. I don't eat fast food every day. I'm like, it's gross. I don't know, that's just not healthy. And when you mention like they make a discovery today, but and they're cheering themselves on. But Weston Price has already found that out a long time ago.
A long time ago, yes. But I think that, there are forces at work here. One of the big ones, of course, is that we would like to believe that it's possible to eat food out of a box with an expiration date 2 years down the road, and that it's okay. We would like to believe that because it's so convenient. So, like my mother didn't have to get out of bed to feed my brother and me breakfast because we could eat our boxed, convenient product, and we thought it was great,
Right.
but it's not.
Right.
So there's that force, and then of course there's the force of the people that sell it to us, because they make a lot more money selling us processed food than they would if they sold us the whole grain flour to make our own stuff. If you think about it, there's not much of a profit margin in oats.
Yeah.
But there's a big profit margin when you roll it up and add a bunch of sugar and a bunch of other stuff and then turn it into a packaged convenient food.
Do you know if Dr. Weston Price, did he do any studies into the autonomic nervous system as well?
No, the autonomic nervous system was not part of his
Okay.
thing,
Okay.
so to
Okay.
speak.
All right.
He was actually doing his travels at the same time that a lot of the people I was talking about were doing their investigations and putting their thoughts together. So he wouldn't necessarily have even known about that.
Okay. Fascinating. Okay. That's good. That is good. The work of Dr. Francis Pottenger, I have down that he lived from 1869 to 1961. He did do a lot of work regarding the autonomic nervous system, correct?
Yes, I think you're talking about Dr. Pottenger Sr. There were two of them, with both were Francis Marion Pottenger. So there's Junior and Senior.
Okay.
And and they were both physicians. They worked together. They had a treatment center for tuberculosis in California. And the senior Dr. Pottenger was actually a very prominent physician. Amongst other things, he, for a year, was the president of the American College of Physicians, which is the flagship organization for doctors practicing internal medicine. So he was no slouch, let me put it that way. And he actually published some papers and books that discuss the autonomic nervous system in detail. So he was definitely interested in it. The Francis Pottenger Jr. Did a study with cats. It's a fairly well-known in the alternative world, where he took one group of cats and fed them on raw food, and another group of cats had fed them on cooked food, and noticed the health over various generations. So with the raw foods, the cats were happy, healthy, had normal kittens, down through the generations. They were very well nourished and successful cats, so to speak. And the ones fed on cooked food exclusively, their health deteriorated over the generations. So there's many people that know the cat story that look around at the health of Americans now and say, well, we're a fourth or fifth generation Pottenger cats, because I believe our health has deteriorated.
Fascinating. Cats, cooked food versus raw food.
Right.
Amazing. Some of this is so basic and so profound at the same time. We bring, not, I wasn't intending to talk about animals, but I think about everybody's pets, their dogs or their cats, they get sick today. The food that the animals eat, that they buy, the dog food or the cat food, I'm like, I've thought to myself, well, that's not what these animals like 200 years ago were eating. No wonder that the animal's getting sick. And I mean, I know folks that they give their pets medications. It costs them. I know someone that just was tending to their pet and was spending $1,000 a month. I'm like, That's steep, right?
It is steep.
That's steep. But we love our pets, right? And there's nothing wrong with that. But I'm like, gosh, if we keep looking at the way history is rolling out, food seems just to play a really big role. I mean, not just in the life of an animal, but the life of a human being as well, and which way we're going to go. It's scary. But it's a good alarm. It's like, hey, wake up here, wake up. We need to check ourselves regarding what we're eating and putting into our mouth every day. I'm thinking about the biases in the integrative cancer world, and a big bias is eat a plant-based diet, right? That's pretty popular. The keto thing is popular too, though. You have a lot of advocates on the keto side. And so I want to ask you something and just tell me if this would be a fair statement, because I'm thinking about something I might say to someone after this podcast because of my understanding of the autonomic nervous system. This is influential because there's some studies out there that seem to indicate that there's a correlation between eating a high beef diet and colon cancers, as an example. But when I think about our discussion in the autonomic nervous system, it's possible that the people that are getting those cancers are sympathetic, and they were eating a lot of beef, which really wasn't conducive to their autonomic nervous system. Would that be a fair statement?
Yes, it would. So the idea then being that the people that shouldn't eat that food are the ones that are going to get sick from that food.
Right. Because that just changes the discussion completely. It turns into a different topic altogether. So this leads me to the next question. Again, we're not prescribing anything here to people, but for healthy people, so an individual doesn't have cancer and they're interested in the autonomic nervous system. They're like, well, what should I eat? Is there like a test? Is there somebody out there on the internet that does an individualized study to figure out like where people's preferences lie, if they're parasympathetic or sympathetic, so they could kind of change their diet accordingly? Is something like that exist?
Well, there are various tests that purport to do that, and I say purport because the reliability of some of those tests is a little questionable, and I say that partly because many times the questions that are asked are things like do you tend to be irritable? Are you easily angered? How many people are going to say yes to that? We all like to look good, and I think that many people with an overactive sympathetic system, they especially like to look good, and so they will be more inclined to answer that in a way that makes them sound like they're very balanced, very zen, very calm. Their wife, their children, their co-workers may say something completely different, but they will misrepresent themselves to some extent, and that can throw off the result of the test.
Okay.
So what I would say rather is, again, listen to your body, and that most people are fairly balanced to a little bit on the sympathetic side. So most people, you keep hearing about the Mediterranean diet, although there's like a million different variants on it. But actually, the Mediterranean diet is pretty good for most people, but there's going to be exceptions. And I'll also say that as you eat cleaner food, as your body is, detoxifies in effect, is less inflamed, then your sense of what's good will improve. So that, for instance, just taking yourself as an example, if you were to be eating what you could call a Mediterranean type diet with a lot of vegetables, some grains, maybe a little dairy, a little fish, a little chicken, and then you suddenly wake up and you've had a dream about a hamburger, that's a sign that on that particular day, your metabolism has shifted a little bit and you need a hamburger to get it back. So then you go out and you get the healthiest hamburger, or ideally you make yourself the healthiest hamburger you can, and you eat it. And then you may not want red meat again for another 2 months. Whereas somebody else with whose metabolism is a little bit further to the other side, they might go on that Mediterranean diet and then find themselves dreaming about hamburger every day, in which case that's their metabolism saying, hey, you need to be over here. You need to eat a little bit more red meat than what you're doing. And that person should just listen to themselves.
One of the things that has struck me in our conversation is I've heard you say about, listening to your body. You're speaking intuitively. You're like, hey, tune into what your craving is. And when I think of medical doctors, that's not something I think about, right? That the doctor's going to say, let's do your own gut check time here. What is your intuition telling you? What is your body telling you? It's refreshing to hear that. And you seem to put, credence in it that this is probably what you need. Eat it.
Right. Mm-hmm.
And you follow that advice for yourself.
I do, yes. And actually, last weekend I was actually at a conference, and they provided lunch, and the schedule was very tight, so there really wasn't. And there was actually a lecture during lunch that I wanted to hear on both days, and the lunch was awful, which was really kind of surprising. I mean, it was full of stuff that I really didn't want to eat, and between that and the travel, because you really have to plan ahead if you're going to eat decent food when you're traveling. And I didn't plan ahead, so I wound up not really eating the way I usually do. By the time I got home, I was thinking to myself, I could kill for a vegetable.
Wow.
Now, I'm really glad that I don't have to kill anybody to get a vegetable, but I just wanted vegetables. And so I was, in effect, listening to my body, and my body was saying, what are you doing to me? What is this stuff? This is not what you eat. What did you do this for? Yeah.
In a very short period of time, mind you.
Right.
Yeah, your body rebelled and said, hey, give me a veggie. Wow, that's fascinating. Okay. So we've discussed the autonomic nervous system, which is a component of your protocol. And we've discussed, hey, that you're going to put the patient on a different diet depending upon their autonomic nervous system and the diagnosis that they have. Earlier, and we didn't dive into him, but I want to take a little bit of a deep dive now. You mentioned Dr. William Kelley, right? And he was also a dentist in the 1960s. And he's an individual that really began to put different pieces to the puzzle together, it sounds like to me.
Right.
He started incorporating the autonomic nervous system, food. He gets into the pancreatic enzymes, which we'll discuss and all. And I think he also starts doing the coffee enemas as well, right? So he does the grand slam of sorts. And Dr. Kelley was a dentist as well. Who did Dr. Kelley learn this from? How did he stumble upon this particular protocol, which is the protocol that you're using today? But how did he find it?
Well, that's a tough one to answer. I mean, I did know Dr. Kelley for a brief period, maybe about 9 months that I spent with him, but I never asked him that question. And so I don't know what he would have said. I know that there were predecessors for all of the different aspects of what he synthesized. So, for instance, I know that he read Francis Pottenger Sr.'s work. And so I'm presuming that he found the same article that I recently found that really lays out many of the same principles that Kelley used in terms of the autonomic nervous system, diet, and the roles of calcium, magnesium, and potassium. The way that works, magnesium and potassium, magnesium tones down an overactive sympathetic system. Calcium stimulates the sympathetic system, and potassium stimulates the parasympathetic system. So by utilizing those minerals, typically magnesium and potassium you give to a sympathetic dominant, calcium you give to a parasympathetic dominant. And by using those minerals in different amounts, you can adjust autonomic physiology. So that and diet is what Kelley used and what I use.
So I got to ask this question regarding the autonomic nervous system.
Mm-hmm.
Has there been a book written in recent times that's really like simplified about the autonomic nervous system to help the layperson understand the topic at all?
Not really, no.
Okay, because it's a pretty, I don't know, it's a heady topic, kind of get my mind around and all, but fascinating nonetheless. Okay. Well, I want to talk about Dr. Kelley, Dr. William Donald Kelley. He was the orthodontist that started incorporating the autonomic nervous system, the diet, pancreatic enzymes, which we haven't spoken about yet, but we will, coffee enemas. He starts incorporating this on himself because he himself has pancreatic cancer. Is that correct?
Yeah, well, the way that I heard Kelley's story myself was that Dr. Kelley was an orthodontist by training, and so he was treating kids with crooked teeth. And he noticed that he would ask the parents, "Did you ever have braces yourself?" And they would say no, and their teeth were perfect. And the kids needed braces. So he started to wonder, well, why would that be? And he actually found Dr. Price's work and realized that nutrition was important. But he wasn't doing it himself. Like many people, it was all academic and he wasn't applying it in his own life. Mm-hmm. And then at a fairly young age, in his late 30s, he developed cancer. And it was never biopsied, but bear in mind that that was the normal thing for that era because it was the early 1960s. There weren't too many methods of treatment available. He had a mass in his abdomen that could be felt, and he had lost something like 50 pounds. So here you have this man that looks like a walking skeleton with a mass in his abdomen. So do you need to take him to the operating room to figure out what it is? No. And they could tell that it couldn't be cured by surgery. So they told him to get his affairs in order, and they never made a formal diagnosis. And that was normal for that era. So instead of or in addition, hopefully, to getting his affairs in order, he put himself on a vegetarian diet. And with that diet, he stabilized. He wasn't getting better, but he wasn't getting worse. And that was certainly an improvement. But then he decided to start taking a lot of pancreatic enzymes because his digestion was terrible. And he went to see a pharmacist who suggested pancreatic enzymes, especially since the theory was that he had pancreatic cancer, although it hadn't been biopsied. And so they said, pancreatic cancer, maybe you're not making enough enzymes. Why don't you take enzymes? So he took enzymes. He took a lot of enzymes. And what he found was that the nature of the mass that he could feel in his abdomen started to change.
When Dr. Kelley gets his pancreatic cancer, he's in his 30s. He's an orthodontist. He has learned about the autonomic nervous system. He's learned about diet. He starts taking pancreatic enzymes. Explain to me, why does he start taking pancreatic enzymes? To the best of your knowledge, what tipped him off to this?
Well, Kelley had started off by modifying his diet. His mother apparently came to stay with him and threw out all his junk food. And he was eating a lot of grains and nuts and seeds and vegetable juice. Apparently, he got a goat and put the goat in his backyard to the mortification of his children and was drinking goat milk. He modified his diet pretty extensively, and with that, his condition stabilized. But his digestion wasn't very good. He was having a lot of gas and bloating, symptoms like that. And so, as I was told this story, he went to a pharmacist and described his symptoms, and the pharmacist said, why don't you try pancreatic enzymes? Especially since they're saying that most likely this mass in your abdomen is pancreatic cancer, you may not not be making enough enzymes, so why don't you take a bunch of enzymes? So he did. And he actually took even more than what the pharmacist suggested because his digestion was terrible. And with the enzymes, his digestion improved. But he also noted the mass in his abdomen that he could feel started to change. It started to soften up. It seemed like it was changing. And so he then decided it's time to go to the library. He was a researcher by nature. He went to the library and discovered that, yes, there was some discussion about pancreatic enzymes in cancer. That's when he found the work of John Beard. So Beard was the first one to discuss the concept that pancreatic enzymes might have an action against cancer. So Kelley found Beard's work.
What did Beard do for a living? What is his title? Who is he? What does he do?
Yeah, Dr. John Beard was actually the equivalent of a PhD, and he was a teacher in embryology at the University of Edinburgh in Scotland. And so what's an embryologist? That's a doctor that's studying the very early stages of life, the embryo. And what Beard had observed, as had many others in that era, was that the cells of the embryo, which are rapidly growing and dividing, look and act somewhat like cancer does. But Beard really focused on a particular embryonic cell called the trophoblast. The trophoblast is the precursor to the placenta, and the placenta is the connection between the mother and baby that allows the baby to get the nutrients it needs and to get rid of the waste it needs to get rid of into the mother's body. And so that the early stage of the placenta, the trophoblast cells, their job is as the baby, as the embryo travels into the uterus, the trophoblast cells latch on, invade, create a blood supply for those nutrient and waste materials to exchange. And also, while Beard didn't really talk about this, part of the trophoblast job is to, in effect, fool the mother's immune system because the baby is genetically different from the mother. So if you were to transplant, say, a kidney from a son to a mother, because the genetics are not the same, that mother would have to take a lot of immunosuppressants to not reject the kidney. But with a pregnancy, that doesn't need to happen. Why? Because the trophoblast, the cells are able to, in effect, fool the mother into thinking there's nothing to react to here. So cancer cells also invade. Cancer cells also create a blood supply. Cancer cells are genetically different enough that you would think the body would react to them, but it doesn't. But there's one big difference between cancer and the trophoblast/placenta, and that is that the trophoblast matures into the placenta and stops invading. If it just kept going, it would eat its way through the uterus and kill the mother. No good for the mother, no good for the baby. But the trophoblast stops, and Beard noticed that and said, what's the signal? Why does it stop going? He looked at what was going on in the bodies of both the mother and the baby in humans and in other species. And what he realized was that at the time that the trophoblast matures, the baby has started making pancreatic enzymes. Now, in traditional or physiology, and really physiology now for that matter, it's believed that the only role pancreatic enzymes have is to digest food. But here's the baby making enzymes 2 months into a 9-month gestation. So why is the baby making pancreatic enzymes so early? Generally speaking, nature is pretty conservative. So the lungs, for example, are not really ready to go until the last few months of pregnancy. But here the baby's making enzymes months before it's going to see a meal. Why? Well, if the purpose of those enzymes is to control the behavior of the trophoblast, then it makes all kinds of sense that the baby is making pancreatic enzymes so early. And so then Beard took the next jump, and which is to say, if pancreatic enzymes control the behavior of the trophoblast, and if trophoblast cells are very similar to cancer cells, well, then maybe pancreatic enzymes can control the behavior of cancer cells. And that was his theory that he put forth into the world. Now, what Beard speculated was that trophoblast cells, that we all carry around cells that are similar to trophoblast cells in our body. And he speculated that they were like a reserve, so that if your body needed to make more colon cells, for example, that the trophoblast cells that were there would serve as a reserve. What he was really talking about, in effect, was stem cells. And his speculation was that pancreatic enzymes could control the behavior of those cells. And so therefore, if we develop cancer, then it means either that we just simply don't make enough enzymes for whatever reason, or that the stimulus to make cancer cells overwhelms the ability of the pancreatic enzymes we make to control it. In other words, some people don't make enough enzymes, and some people make enough enzymes, but meanwhile they're smoking, they're eating the wrong foods, their diet is terrible. They stimulate more cancer cells than they can manage with the enzymes they make.
Absolutely fascinating. Fascinating. And Dr. Beard, he lived when? When was his time period?
Well, his seminal book, The Enzyme Treatment of Cancer and Its Scientific Basis, was published in 1911. Now, he was not a scientist. I mean, he was not a physician. He was a scientist. So he was not able to put into practice what he wanted to with patients. He wasn't a doctor. Various doctors did try out his methods, and there were some successes and there were some that didn't succeed. What he said was that when it didn't work was that the enzyme preparation probably wasn't good quality. And you bear in mind that we're talking about an era when the only people that had refrigerators were big meat packing plants. Everybody else had ice boxes or nothing. And so doctors would get potentially poor quality enzyme preparations, which were available for other purposes. So they'd get these enzymes and they'd add water because they were dehydrated products. They'd add water and then just leave it sit around before they would use it in the patient. And so you can see that there's a number of things that could go wrong in this whole process. But there were some patients that got better. But meanwhile, there were other methods of treatment that came into vogue, like surgery and radiation. And those were billed as being an easy, universally effective, non-toxic. That was what was believed at the time. And so Beard's work, because it was complicated, he's saying, well, you've got to have good quality enzymes. And Beard was recommending that doctors go to a slaughterhouse and collect a pancreas and mince it up and use that. Your average doctor really doesn't want to do that. And meanwhile, Madame Curie comes along. She's billed as the spokeswoman for radiation. Radiation was being used not only for cancer, but for complexion issues. It was a really crazy era when you look back on it. And so Beard's work basically got pushed aside. It would be another 10 years before people would realize that radiation was not non-toxic and not universally effective. Madame Curie herself died of radiation toxicity. But by that time, Beard was dead and gone, and his work was pretty much forgotten, not 100%. There were some doctors over subsequent years that tried out enzymes with cancer. But for the most part, the medical world they tend to look at theory as opposed to results. And so the theory at that point was, what is this business about trophoblast cells and embryology? And, everybody knows that cancer develops from mature cells. The whole idea of stem cells had gone into remission, I guess you could say, for decades. And so Beard's underlying theories were dismissed. The idea that pancreatic enzymes were used for anything other than digestion was poo-pooed. And so overall, people had pretty much forgotten about Beard's work until Dr. Kelley came along and was using high-dose pancreatic enzymes, first for himself and then for others.
So for the layperson, as I think about the work of Dr. John Beard, he makes note that a baby in the womb, the behavior of what's taking place there is similar to the way cancer cells behave. Is that a fair statement?
It is a fair statement. And when you think about it, a baby goes from one cell to a full-grown thing you need both arms to pick up in 9 months. So cancer actually grows a lot slower than a baby. Yeah.
Okay. And this trophoblast, this technical term, is what's being used to describe the placenta's growth?
The trophoblast is the type of cell that latches onto the uterus, invades, creates a blood supply.
Got it. Okay.
And then it matures into the placenta.
Okay. And so the parallel with cancer would be the way cancer likes to grow, invade, create a blood supply, because without the blood, a solid tumor cannot grow.
Exactly.
So the trophoblast is doing it. There's a parallel there. He notices it. But then he also notices it stops growing. And why does it stop growing?
Exactly.
Is his question. And then he notes that the baby, at about 2 months of pregnancy, begins to release pancreatic enzymes, which slows down the growth of the placenta itself.
It changes the character from a very invasive tissue into one that kind of settles down and it's not as aggressive.
Right.
It settles down.
Tames it.
It tames it. And then at delivery, the placenta just neatly peels off and leaves the uterus intact.
And if this didn't happen in the mother's body, I mean, she would die because the placenta would just continue to grow. I mean, there would be an explosion in there, right?
Right.
Baby would pass on to. So it's the child that is releasing the pancreatic enzymes.
Yes.
The child at 2 months. That's just a work of God, Dr. Isaac. That's just like, wow. That's just mind-blowing.
I mean, I'll add that there is a form of cancer that can form from the trophoblast cells, and that happens when there is no baby. Like somehow the embryo gets off track and there's a trophoblast cells, but there's no child. And that's a form of cancer, and it can be a very aggressive cancer.
Interesting.
Fortunately, it's a cancer that is very responsive to treatment. But conventional treatment. But nonetheless, that cancer occurs when there's no baby, hence no baby making the pancreatic enzymes that control the behavior of the trophoblast cells.
What is that form of cancer called?
It's called choriocarcinoma.
Wow. That just blows my mind. So, okay. You mentioned that enzymes have been thought of for digestive purposes, but we're using also the word pancreatic enzyme, which sounds like a different kind of enzyme. Is it a different kind of enzyme?
Well, the word enzyme is actually very, very broad.
Okay.
Enzymes can do all kinds of different things. Your body runs on enzymes, and enzymes are typically proteins. Enzymes are things that facilitate reactions. So in other words, if I add sugar to this glass of water, it's just going to sit there. But if I spit, put some of my own amylase in, it will break up those molecules. So enzymes facilitate reactions that otherwise, if we were to wait for them to happen spontaneously, we'd be waiting for 100 years. So that's the role of an enzyme. Pancreatic enzymes specifically are a suite of enzymes that digest our food. So there are some that digest proteins, that's the proteolytic enzymes. There are some that digest fats, and there are some that digest carbohydrates. The proteolytic enzymes, Beard believed, and I believe, are the ones that are active against the trophoblast cells.
Do our bodies make those naturally?
Yes, our bodies naturally make pancreatic enzymes. So every time we eat, our body will secrete those enzymes to digest our food. Now, people can develop a pancreatic insufficiency where they don't make the enzymes. And when that happens, you find out because your food doesn't digest. So you get gas and bloating and undigested stool, and you lose weight. You really become quite unhealthy if you don't make the enzymes.
What part of the body's making pancreatic enzymes? Is it an organ? Is it what?
Well, the pancreas is the name of the organ that actually makes pancreatic enzymes.
Okay. Okay. Is there food or drink that encourages the growth of pancreatic enzymes in our body?
I don't know of anything that will make your body more efficient at making those enzymes.
Okay.
I do know, there are certain foods that will use up more of the enzymes. So, for instance, a high meat diet, because it's a lot of protein, will need more enzymes to digest it. So that's part of why if someone who has an overactive sympathetic system chooses to eat a lot of meat, they typically don't have as strong a pancreas to make the enzymes. But our body, our first priority is going to be digesting food as opposed to surveilling for cancer. Because if you think about it, what matters now is our food. What matters 30 years from now is a cancer diagnosis. So if we choose to eat a hamburger and we're not genetically geared to digest that hamburger well, then our body's going to put all the enzymes into our digestive tract, and it's not going to have anything available to go look for stem cells that are misbehaving.
And not to get too sidetracked right now, but when you talk about stem cells misbehaving, are we talking about a cancer stem cell? Are we just talking about stem cell?
Well, the distinction, there's a continuum, so to speak, of a normal stem cell that then decides to go rogue.
Okay.
So what we believe, and this would be based on Beard's work, and bear in mind that nobody in the regular medical community has looked at this work in a long, long time. So what we believe is that, that whole process of the stem cell going rogue and turning into a cancer cell, that's a gradual thing, but that enzymes can help keep it going back to where it's doing its job as opposed to going rogue.
Okay. So coming back full circle, Dr. William Kelley discovers the pancreatic enzymes, discovers the work of Dr. Beard. And he goes, well, I'm going to start incorporating this to doctor himself for his own pancreatic cancer. And how many pancreatic enzymes does he start to take for himself? I mean, what?
I don't really know the exact dosing. And I'll also say that, at least the way that I heard it, it wasn't so much that Kelley found Beard's work and said, here's how I'm going to treat myself. It was more that Kelley started taking a lot of enzymes, noticed the character of the mass change, and then went and found Beard's work.
Got it.
And I make a point of that just because currently, and perhaps always, people seem to put so much emphasis on theory as opposed to results. But the way biology works, the way science works, ideally, is that you observe something and then you figure out why.
Good
as
point.
opposed to coming up with an elaborate theory about why and then trying to incorporate it.
Good point.
Because theory doesn't always pan out. Theory is cheap. And, I myself, as a medical doctor, having been trained, a few years back, I can already tell you that there are elaborate theories that I learned in medical school that turned out to be dead wrong.
Mm.
So I look at results, and honestly, I the reason I do this work is because I saw results from Kelley's practice. And since then, I've seen results from my practice and from Dr. Nicholas Gonzalez's practice. And it's those results that keep me going. Theory is cheap.
I completely agree with you. So much of this is resonating with me because I know in my own life, in just my own health and wellness, that when something's going right, results, in other words, I'll then ask, why is this happening to me? Why did I make a turn for the better? And I'll start backtracking, like trying to figure out how I was sleeping, what I was eating, when I ate. I mean, I just start to try to pick it apart. And then I go, oh, I think this might have been, here's a clue, I think, as to why my health is improving in this regard. And so I like what you're saying, that, theory is, it is what it is. But because we do the same thing when we get sick, right? Oh, I have an ailment. And we're like, well, how did I get to this place? What caused this ailment, right? So this is fascinating. So that's a good thing to point out that Dr. Kelley was taking the enzymes, starts getting some positive results from it.
Exactly.
Something encouraging is happening. He's like, well, why is this happening to me? Goes to the library, starts reading, finds Beard and goes, oh, look at this guy, that lived 60 years ago or whatever. And he found out that there's something here. That would make me really excited if I was in Dr. Kelley's shoes. Obviously, that would thrill me, actually. It's always good to have a reassurance like, oh, wow, there's the dot. It's being connected. Okay.
I'll also add, over the years, as I mentioned, there were physicians that picked up on what Beard was doing. And one of them is a very interesting gentleman named Dr. Shively. And Shively was a surgeon, but toward the end of his career, he got interested in Beard's work and he decided to start treating people with intravenous enzymes. So he was working from probably the mid-1950s up until around 1964. And he actually got some very interesting results with his intravenous enzymes. And what happened, though, was that the FDA heard about what he was doing and came to check him out and said, you shouldn't be doing this with people. You should be doing it with animals first. You're not going through the appropriate steps. And so they shut him down. So what he did was took copies of all of his research notes, in effect. He bound it into a book, which he had reproduced, and he sent a copy to every medical school in the country. And I happen to have one of those copies because I believe that Dr. Nicholas Gonzalez picked it up from Dr. Kelley and we still had it. So I recently went through that a couple of years ago as I was getting ready to write my big review article about pancreatic enzymes and cancer. And it may well be that was one of the things that Dr. Kelley found. Now, Beard believed that the enzymes had to be injected. Shively was using intravenous. But meanwhile, Kelley was swallowing them, and he was getting some results. And that didn't require all of the hoops that you have to jump through to be injecting things into people's bodies. I'm not necessarily blaming the FDA for that. The reality is we should have to prove a lot before we start injecting things into people's bodies. But Kelley serendipitously, in effect, discovered that oral enzymes could work.
Fascinating. So Dr. Shively,
yes,
who was a surgeon in the 1950s to 64, he's leaving surgical work. He starts investigating Dr. Beard.
Yes. During
that time. And he decides, hey, I'm going to take this a step further and I'm going to do this with an IV. And he starts giving people pancreatic enzymes through an IV, which I wish I knew how much he was giving them and all those kind of questions, right? But you said he got some interesting results. I mean, was he? What did he have?
Did.
Patients getting better?
There were patients that got better. What would happen, like for instance, as I recall, the results, I think people's tumors would shrink or go away, or malignant effusions, that's collection of fluids, would resolve. He definitely got some good results. One of the problems with what he was doing was that he would stop too soon from my point of view. In other words, the patient would feel better and he couldn't find anything on physical exam, so everybody would decide that, okay, hey, it's good. But then a few months later, the patient would be sick again. And, he wasn't getting a whole lot of support from other doctors. Perhaps he himself would say, oh, it didn't work, as opposed to, I needed to have kept it going. Because bear in mind that Kelley and myself would say that cancer is more like a chronic disorder than like pneumonia, for example. But this was the 1950s, and people were all excited about how antibiotics could cure infectious illnesses that killed people routinely, 20 years earlier. So people wanted, in effect, a quick fix. They wanted, they would do their enzymes and think, okay, now it's supposed to be gone. And then when it come back 3 months later, 6 months later, a year later, they'd say, oh, it didn't work.
Okay.
But really what they needed was some form of maintenance, because the whole idea is our bodies make enzymes, but if they don't make enough enzymes, then you're gonna get cancer.
Interesting.
Potentially.
Yeah. I could see the comment, why approaching cancer like a chronic disease, if the body's not making enough pancreatic enzymes on its own, and you begin to take them orally as an example, in a maintenance setting, you would want to do that the rest of your life to keep it at bay, to hold it in check anyway.
Exactly. And so, again, sometimes people with diet-based methods or with pancreatic enzymes, they want to say, well, I'm going to do this for 2 years and then I'm going to go back to my old life. Well, if you go back to your old life, you're going to go back to where you went.
Yeah. That's just not a good way to do anything. I mean, it would be like cleaning up your diet. You decide, I'm not going to eat processed food anymore for 2 years. And then you decide to go on a binge and you go, I'm going to eat macaroni and cheese out of a box now for the next 5 years. That's not healthy. That's just not a good way of approaching life. Wow. Okay. And so, but Dr. Beard was of the opinion that the pancreatic enzyme should be injected. Yes. I guess like through a syringe, I would assume, into the body. And
yes, he was advocating, like I said, going to a slaughterhouse, getting a pancreas, mincing it up, and injecting it directly into tumor masses. Right. Which, according to some of his critics, there was one surgeon in particular that treated a series of people that had failed, that surgery didn't cure them. So he then treated a bunch of people with enzymes and said, oh, it just doesn't work. And it's also incredibly painful. And, this is terrible. You shouldn't be doing this to people. Beard's response to that was, first of all, that you waited until the patient was so sick that they weren't going to benefit. And secondly, you didn't use good quality enzymes. But, in that era, the surgeon's viewpoint was more persuasive. And everybody was thinking that radiation was going to be a magic bullet, which of course it was not.
Right. Thank you for explaining the miracle pancreatic enzymes in the body. I hope I have plenty of these floating around, and you do too, and everyone else. But in the case of the patient that has cancer, and it's like Dr. Kelley as an example, and he begins to take pancreatic enzymes. And then what year was it that you met Dr. Kelley, Dr. Isaacs? What year did you meet him?
I met Dr. Kelley for the first time, as I recall, in 1984.
Okay.
And then from the summer of 86 until the spring of 87, I actually lived in the same house with him for a while.
86 to 87?
Yeah.
Wow. So you meet him in the 80s, and he's already 20 years out from pancreatic cancer. I mean,
Well, yeah, and again, I always say presume pancreatic
right,
cancer.
I get it.
But, again, it's like common sense tells you if he really had a mass in his abdomen, if he really lost 50 pounds, given the limitations of diagnostic technology in that era, yeah, he had pancreatic cancer.
Yeah. It was a different era. The way they diagnosed was different. So I get all of that. But he still, when he was originally met with his doctors, he was given a short time to live, if I remember correctly. He wasn't given a long time to live. That was in the 60s.
That's right.
And here you are sharing a home with them in the mid 80s. The man is still alive.
Yeah.
I mean, he's getting to the 30-year point or something. That's incredible. At that time, is he still following his same protocol for himself?
Not really, no.
Interesting. Okay.
He, at that point, he'd been through a lot. His life was a very difficult one. And, because once he got through his own cancer journey, his community noticed, they noticed that this man that looked like a walking skeleton was back to his old self, and they wanted to know what he did. People started coming to him because they had cancer and they wanted to know what he did. And as many of those people got well, and so they told other people, and bit by bit, his practice changed from straightening teeth to straightening out metabolism and straightening out cancer. And so that brought him to the attention of the medical authorities, because that's not what you're supposed to be doing as a dentist.
Right.
And then he wrote a book called One Answer to Cancer, which was a little skinny volume on how to treat your own cancer, which got him into even more hot water. So, he wound up in battles to be able to publish the book and battles to maintain his dental license. He moved from Texas to a little town in the state of Washington, and he was practicing there. Then he got involved in the treatment of Steve McQueen, the actor, which brought him to the attention of the media. And that's how he wound up meeting Nick Gonzalez, the other doctor that I worked with for so many years. Nick had been a journalist before he went to medical school. And so when Kelley burst on the scene, a fellow journalist came to Nick and said, "Why don't you check out this guy Kelley? Because he seems like maybe there's something there worth investigating." So Nick went and met Kelley and decided, yes, there was something to investigate. And so Nick was in the middle of his investigation of Kelley's work when I met Nick. I was a medical student. Nick was the intern on the team. And, things kind of went forward from there. But you were asking whether Kelley was actually following his own treatment at that point.
20 years later.
And he was taking supplements. His diet was not the best. I think he had kind of compromised as he was getting older and just tired. So no, he wasn't following his own advice perfectly at that point.
By your estimation or guesstimation, how many cancer patients did Dr. Kelley end up helping?
There again, I really have no idea, but I know that, and he saw other people besides cancer patients. But having said that, I believe thousands, over a 15, 20-year period.
And this is all just because of his own personal health story that they heard about this man, a dentist, Dr. Kelley, who got sick with cancer and, took care of himself. He got better. And they're like, "Can you help me, please?"
It just sort of snowballed, and that was an era when there really wasn't much available in terms of regular medical treatment.
So Dr. Isaacs, going back to Dr. Kelley, I'm fascinated by him, obviously, because he's, I suppose, the most recent authority, I guess, on this topic, because he was a patient and he's implementing this particular protocol on himself. And he did survive, over 20 more years and all. And he helped a variety of individuals that had cancer that came to him. Did he keep any kind of case file on those patients? Like, did he track how many patients he actually helped over the years that he knew about?
Well, this would feed into a discussion of Dr. Nicholas Gonzalez's review of Kelley's charts, because Kelley did keep records.
Mm-hmm.
He apparently kept fairly detailed records. Now, I don't really know if he would, track down people that didn't actually return to him, so to speak, but he kept meticulous records. Now, he was, to the best of my knowledge, he never really was intent on publishing in the medical literature himself. Given that he'd been persecuted for doing the kind of work that he did, I don't know if he was really interested in that.
Mm-hmm.
But Nick, at the time that he was doing his research into Kelley's files, reviewed thousands of Kelley's charts, sent out questionnaires to, as I recall, 1,300 people,
Wow.
and then interviewed nearly 500 of them in depth, and gathered medical records and such on some of them, and then put it together into the 50 cases that he did for his book. I know, one of the little interesting side notes about Kelley is that I heard from Nick that Kelley had said that one of the articles in the medical literature about spontaneous remission of a particular type of lymphoma, that the practitioner that wrote this article up was actually working in the Pacific Northwest, which is where Kelley was at the time, and that a number of the patients that that were described as a spontaneous remission were actually Kelley patients.
Oh, wow.
So there was nothing spontaneous about it.
Wow. Okay.
Yeah. So he did keep records.
Okay. So Dr. Nicholas Gonzalez, and for anyone that's not heard that name, you could type up Dr. Nicholas Gonzalez and you'll find a lot of information regarding his work in this area as well. But so Dr. Gonzalez reviews Dr. Kelley's case files. There's over 1,000 there. And he puts together a book, of 50 cases and all. But would it be fair to say that this was very convincing data for him personally, for Dr. Gonzalez and yourself at the time, that, hey, this is very, very it's persuading us here?
Yes. I mean, this was really the work that changed the course of Nick's life and of my own as well, because, the information about spontaneous remissions, they're not really that common. And a researcher that investigated spontaneous remissions said in an article that the likelihood of any one practitioner seeing 3 spontaneous remissions over the course of their career was extremely unlikely, to the point of being statistically impossible, he said. So here we have Kelley having seen a number of patients with biopsy-proven cancer that should have killed them, still alive and well many years later. And from what Nick said when he reviewed Kelley's files, there were actually many patients who had stories of masses, stories of terrible things going on in their bodies, but they never even bothered to see a doctor. They just went straight to Dr. Kelley, and so Dr. Kelley described his examination, but there was no proof of the cancer. But nonetheless, these people had gotten well. So there were quite a number, too many to account for by chance or some sort of magic. There had to be something in what Kelley was doing. That was our conviction.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. What year was this when the two of you became very, you were persuaded by all this work?
Well, I met Nick in 1983. That's when Nick was doing his medical internship, and I was a third-year medical student. We were assigned to the same internal medicine team. So I was working with him. He was trying to keep up with his research, although as a medical intern, he didn't have much time to do it. But he was in the middle of the project and willing to talk to anybody who would listen. I was willing to listen. So even at the time that I graduated medical school, I knew that this was the direction I wanted to go. And Nick, of course, was already full-fledged following this path.
So that's 1983. But
1985, 86.
Okay.
Yeah.
And that corresponds to the same time period you're meeting Dr. Kelley?
That's correct.
Okay. 85, 86. By this time, in meeting with Dr. Kelley, you're convinced you're going to alter the course of your career at this point because it's so persuasive. Because Dr. Kelley is a dentist or orthodontist, and this can sound like a very wild, crazy tale, with Dr. Kelley, right? To the outside viewer, but the two of you, Dr. Gonzalez and yourself, you're young medical doctors, and you're seeing it through a different lens. Why are you seeing it through a different lens? Why didn't you get, I guess, become more critical, I guess, or maybe you were, I don't know, but help me understand.
Well, I think that certainly I don't think that Nick went into this expecting to find anything positive, but he found what he found, and for me, I think perhaps I was a little bit more open-minded than some other people might have been. Partly, my mother had an interest in nutrition, and so that may have rubbed off a little bit. But I remember as a medical student, my first year of med school, a lecturer mentioned something as a fact that I happened to know was a theory because I had worked in a biochemistry lab that was trying to prove this theory when I was an undergraduate. And so I was presented with something that I knew wasn't quite correct. And it wasn't a big deal, but I still remember it. In other words, this wasn't like a super mission critical protein that they were making a misstatement about. But I still noticed it. And I said to myself, I wonder how much of what they're teaching us is not really quite correct. And so I think that line of thinking may have made me more open to saying, maybe they don't know everything. Okay. Maybe there is information that comes in from the outside. Okay. The cases speak for themselves. They still do when I look back on them. The cases about Dr. Kelley and what he had. I mean, the one that really stuck in my mind at the time was about a gentleman with metastatic prostate cancer. And I may have the years off a little bit here, but in 1974 or thereabouts, he started to get back pain, and then a year later it had gotten bad enough that he wound up being admitted to the hospital, and they made the diagnosis of metastatic prostate cancer. Now, bear in mind, this is before PSA, before any of the tests that are done now. So, but they did, they did do a biopsy of something, and they made the diagnosis widely metastatic prostate cancer so bad that he was in such terrible pain that he was practically delirious. So they did some radiation, and they gave him synthetic estrogen, which is the only treatment they had at the time. A month later, he's admitted again to the hospital, gets some more radiation. But in the meantime, he was a chiropractor, actually, by trade, and he knew about Kelley's work. So somehow or other, he managed to get himself together and start treatment with Dr. Kelley. So this is in the mid-1970s. 1975, I believe. And at the time that Nick was wrapping up his research project, 1985, he was working part-time, and he was playing violin in a ragtime band. And there was something about the violin and the ragtime band that just has stuck in my memory all these years, because I was seeing similar patients in the hospital, people with prostate cancer in every bone in their body and terrible pain, not tossing on the bed, not able to find a comfortable position. So a person who was that sick in the mid-70s, 10 years later, is functioning normally because of the Kelley program. So, and that's just one case. There were lots more. And, anybody who wants to know how many more can go buy the book One Man Alone and read it. But for me, that was the volume of them. It wasn't just one. It was many. Yeah.
It wasn't one-off, yeah.
It wasn't a one-off. And it said to me, this needs to be followed up on.
Right. Yeah, really what you've outlined is the difference between a theory and results. And Kelley was getting results Bottom line, he might be an orthodontist and all that. And I could see how it would appear questionable for some people looking from the outside in. But nonetheless, he's getting results. And, the numbers are cold. If people are having positive results, they're having positive results. What can you say, right? There's obviously something happening there. And then, as you mentioned, to try to credit some of those to spontaneous remissions, that's not really fair. When they've been on his protocol. When I think of spontaneous remissions, I know that word has come up now quite a bit in the cancer world. Integrative cancer. I've heard that word. When I think of spontaneous remission, I think of a bona fide miracle from God. A miracle happened here. There's no explanation as to why this person got better. But to throw that term around to people that have been doing something or fiddling with a protocol, like let's just say the one that Dr. Kelley was doing, well, you have to take that into account that they actually did this. They did something. Right. Because even in conventional medicine, if somebody had a surgery to remove a tumor and then afterwards they went to go get some type of alternative care, we would have to fairly say they did remove a tumor from their body. I mean, it's only fair to say that is playing a role into the whole outcome, right? Mm-hmm. It's part of the problem when we start talking about statistics and these type of things. We don't know what this patient has done, like in their entirety, right, for their healthcare. Mm-hmm. So this is fascinating. Okay, so then take me post Kelley. Take me. Okay, you're a convert now. Uh-huh. I'll call you a new convert. Right. I'm sure you're excited. Hey, this is an incredible discovery. That's actually, it's got some time on it, but it feels new for you. Mm-hmm. And you're going to begin to now put it into practice with patients, I presume. And you're in what state are you in at this time?
Yeah. All right. So 1986 and heading into 1987, Nick and I were actually staying with Kelley for a while, and Nick was trying to get his monograph with the 50 cases published, either as individual cases in medical journals or else the entire thing as a book. Mm-hmm. And he was unable to get it published because even though the medical records were included with the manuscript, with permission and from the patients, of course, publishers were just not open to publishing it. Either they simply didn't believe that it was true, or else there's actually one letter that we got that they said, well, we think it's important work and it should be published, but not by us because our medical division wouldn't be very happy because this publisher also published medical textbooks. And so meanwhile, Dr. Kelley, he had a difficult life with a lot of persecution over the years, and he started to question our motivations and be rather difficult. And so and Dr. Kelley was not seeing patients at that point. Mm-hmm. And so Nick and I wound up leaving, and Nick had connections in New York City, so we went there. Mm-hmm. Nick started seeing patients. I helped administratively for a while, and then I went back and finished my medical residency. So I then rejoined him in 91. And in 93 is when we moved into a larger office so that I was able to start seeing patients.
Okay.
So that kind of gives you the history. Meanwhile, in the same time period, actually, there had been more and more pressure on the National Cancer Institute and the National Institutes of Health in general about alternative approaches because there was a lot of interest and enthusiasm in the regular, the lay world, like Laetrile, for example. There was a lot of interest in that. And there were various congressmen that felt very strongly that alternative medicine approaches should be investigated. So in 1993, Nick wound up presenting cases of his own, not of Kelley's, to the National Cancer Institute. And I still remember the effort that we went through to collect all these different, he got together the slides from the pathology, so we had to request all of that and get it in. He had the actual radiology stuff. He headed all, this was back before things were images on a disc. It was like these giant, heavy films. And so he went off to Washington with a suitcase full of lots of heavy stuff, and went down and did a presentation. And the cases that he presented are actually also available. So if somebody goes on Amazon and just puts on Nicholas Gonzalez, you can find various books, one of which is the cases that he actually presented there. So that presentation happened, and based on that, the various scientists there kind of said, well, that's all very interesting. And what they proposed was that we do a pilot study in pancreatic cancer. So what that means is that we would, rather than looking back through our charts, looking for the good cases, we would study people going forward from when they came in, and take, we took 11 patients total. Actually, they suggested 10. And they said, he was told verbally at the time that if 3 of the patients lasted a year, 3 out of 10, that would be an impressive result. And as I recall, we had 9 out of 11 that lasted a year.
What form of cancer did they have?
Pancreatic cancer.
Stage 4?
No, it's not. Honestly, the whole stage 4 thing isn't as relevant with pancreatic cancer, because the way it works with pancreatic cancer, if you're stage 4 when you're diagnosed, you've got a life expectancy in general of 3 to 6 months. And if you're stage 2, then you're 6 to 9 months. So it really doesn't make all that much difference in terms of prognosis.
I have a question, so I just want to make sure I got my dates right. So Dr. Gonzalez in 91 goes back to New York to start practicing.
No, 87.
Oh, 87. Okay, so 87. And between 87 and 1993, which is when he makes a presentation to the NCI, right, of his own personal cases now, which is 6 years.
That's right.
Right? There is some impressive content in there in 6 years that he's collected.
Yeah, the fact that he could generate 25 cases in 6 years indicates that there's some good results.
There's something there. Yeah, something's taking place.
And, we were fortunate, at the time, first of all, there was a lot more interest in what I would call a true alternative treatment. In other words, not doing any of the orthodox treatments, but rather only doing what we offer. There was a lot more interest in that kind of approach. Conventional chemo-oncology has generated a lot more treatments. How effective they are is, of course, another question, but they've generated a lot more things to do. In other words, more stuff is treatable, not curable, as they would say. And also, Nick had actually known Dr. Atkins, the prominent diet doctor, the cardiologist who advocated a high-protein diet. He knew him from his journalism days, and so he appeared on Dr. Atkins' radio show, which generated quite a lot of buzz, so to speak. So Nick was actually fairly busy, between the notoriety of Kelley and the notoriety of Robert Atkins and being on his show. So Nick was actually fairly busy almost immediately.
Okay. And then you enter the office in 93, correct?
Yeah.
And you start taking on your own patients there with...
Right. Yeah. I had been, I was off finishing up my residency from 89 to 91. And then I was, working administratively because there wasn't room for me to see patients. And then started seeing patients myself in 93.
How long did it take for you from 93... as you begin to see your own patients? I guess my question is, was it like you were waiting with anticipation to see these positive results, or were you kind of like, well, let's see if this works? What was your approach to all this? I guess as a new doctor treating patients with cancer in this way with this type of protocol, how did you approach it?
Well, it wasn't the easiest thing to be doing, because one of the challenges with this kind of work is that long-term results take long term, and in the meantime, you're treating people, and not everybody's going to do well. It's just the nature of cancer. And also, the patients that we started off seeing were sometimes sicker than, in other words, we needed to learn what we could work with and what we couldn't, in fact. So in the early days, and I'm talking, 1987 to 89 is the period I remember, because I was actually working with Nick. He was the one seeing patients, but I was there. And so I actually spent a lot of time cheering him up, saying, got to remember the cases from the Kelley book, remember what's possible, and just holding on to every positive thing. Now, there was actually a woman that came in to see Nick in 1987, almost one of his first patients, who had widely metastatic breast cancer to the bone. And she was actually still getting chemo when she started on the protocol. I think after, as I recall, she was doing quite well. And after a couple of years, her oncologist is like, I don't think this chemo's got anything to do with anything. We should just stop it. Why are we doing this?
Interesting.
And she continued on the program. And, the last I heard of her was around the time Dr. Gonzalez passed away. But, that's 30 years, having had the diagnosis of metastatic breast cancer in 1987. So it's, there were people doing well from the beginning, but there were also people that weren't making it. And so I was just trying to encourage Nick and keep him going.
Sure.
But by the time I finished my residency and came back, he had started to build up a repertoire of patients that, I could look at and say, yeah,
here they are.
We're reproducing it. It's working. It's happening.
It's exciting.
I remember there was one gentleman, this was after we had moved to the new office and I was seeing patients, but he had metastatic kidney cancer. He was a patient of Nick's, and he had a tumor in the back of his head that was basically like sticking out like an egg. And he had actually had radiation to the thing, but it didn't make any difference. He still had a mass that looked like an egg. And so he came in to see Nick, and he went on the program. And 3 months later, that egg-like projection had resolved. And Nick told me this story. Nick said he was just examining the guy and marveling about it. And the patient finally looked up and looked at him and said, "Isn't that what's supposed to happen?"
Sure.
Now, I'll also say, just in case there's a skeptic out there thinking, yeah, it was the radiation that did it. Radiation isn't all that effective with kidney cancer, supposedly. But the gentleman also had another mass in his lung, and that was never treated. And he lived, another 20 years, I believe. And he eventually passed away, sadly enough, from a stroke that was in the same area of the brain where the radiation had probably affected. But yeah, he was a great guy and such an adherent patient and a real believer, a wonderful guy.
You mentioned, obviously, in those early years, there was patients that didn't do well. And whether it was the patients then or the patients now that don't do well, the patients that don't, is it because they're not compliant or because they've had conventional chemotherapy or radiation already by the time they see you?
All of those things can play a role, and with a lifestyle program where people are doing it at home, it can be pretty difficult to know whether they're doing it or not. And then previous therapy can play a role as well.
Okay.
So it's tough to know. And there's some things that we learned just from working.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Are there patients that you don't recommend this type of protocol to, with cancer, that you're like, no, this probably isn't the right thing for you to do?
Yeah, I have that interaction with patients fairly often, actually.
Okay. And so it's just based upon certain qualifications and practical experience. I would assume after over 30 years that, like, this one's not for them. This one is a yes. This one's a no. Okay.
That's right. Yeah. It's practical experience. And probably, in many cases, I mean, I don't want to, come across as I'm advising people not to do some particular route. But probably the diagnosis that I'm most reluctant to tackle is glioblastoma, the particularly aggressive brain cancer, because many times there's adherence issues because of the neurological damage from the diagnosis. And I can't recall anyone that's really done well with that particular diagnosis. So that's one that I don't see.
It's fair. So going back to 1993, when you started seeing your own patients, how many years of seeing your own patients until you became your own? Wow, this is fantastic, right? I mean, it's not Kelley's work, it's not Gonzalez, it's your own. You're like, wow, this is fun. We're helping people here.
Well, I feel like I was pretty solid that this was effective and this needed to be properly investigated really from the time I came back. Because, again, I had the advantage of seeing the people that Nick had been seeing. He went off to the NCI to present those 25 cases. Well, it was me that went through the records and boiled it, helped to boil it down. He created a manuscript to hand out there. So I was the one going through the charts. I was the one tracking down the records. I was the films and the slides. So that was kind of a crash course in the results, so to speak. Yeah.
I'm sure it was a fun and exciting time.
It was, yeah, definitely.
Okay, that's great. So if I were to summarize the protocol, patient comes in, they have a diagnosis, and based upon their diagnosis, whether it's a solid tumor or let's just say a blood tumor or skin cancer or something of this nature, you're going to identify their autonomic nervous system, if they're a parasympathetic or a sympathetic type of individual. And based upon that, you'll determine the diet that they should be on, and a recommendation will be made for them. And then you're going to incorporate pancreatic enzymes into this protocol. But one thing that we haven't discussed really at all is that there's other supplements that you are probably going to put the patient on.
Right.
Can you speak to that? Does that have to do with the autonomic nervous system? Is it something else altogether? Why other supplements in addition to the pancreatic enzymes?
All right. Well, there are some things that I think most people recognize that they should take some of just to maintain health, like vitamin D, for example, or vitamin K2, which is not that easy to get from the diet and is useful for bone and the use of calcium properly. Vitamin C, the B vitamins, all of those things I would give to really anybody. Now, the amounts will shift a little bit based on the autonomic type, but those are part of the package for everyone. Some of the minerals like magnesium and potassium, for example, are beneficial for people with the overactive sympathetic system. Calcium is beneficial for the people with the overactive parasympathetic system.
Fascinating.
So those will be some of the minerals, and there the goal is to adjust autonomic physiology. Then another thing that we use is glandulars, and that's something that's unfamiliar to a lot of people, but it's freeze-dried animal glands like liver, for example, or lung, or thymus. A number of different glands, and we believe that those things can help the body repair those organs. So that's another piece of the puzzle. It's something that we've always done, that Kelley did before us, part of the way that I operate. Yeah.
Okay, so the glandulars are there to do repair work.
Yes.
Since it's repair work in nature, are those supplements a temporary part of the protocol, or is it no? They're really kind of a maintenance long term.
Some of them are temporary, and some of them I see as more maintenance potentially. And
Okay.
part of it, from my point of view, ties into like things like liver or thymus or pancreas. Those were part of the diet. 200 years ago, our ancestors would have been eating that part of the animal. So that was a dietary component, and I believe one that our bodies were meant to use.
Okay. Got it. So when it's all said and done with all, between the pancreatic enzymes, glandular supplements, how many pills can a patient be taking in a day?
I would anticipate that it would be in the neighborhood of 175 to 200 pills a day. Now, this is for a cancer patient. Most of them, more than half of them, are actually pancreatic enzymes, freeze-dried pancreas.
More than half. Okay.
Yeah, so more than half are the pancreas, but then there are the other things that are designed to help strengthen the body. So they're not taking them all at once.
Right.
The pancreas, the pancreatic enzymes are taken away from meals because they're digestive enzymes. So if you take it with food, they'll just get used up on the food. We have them take it away from meals. And then with the meals are all the other things, the A, the B, the C, the D, the K, the E,
Okay.
the glandulars, the calcium, magnesium, potassium, all of those things go with the meals.
Okay. Got it. So the pancreatic enzymes taken away from the meal so that they're really targeting the cancer, right? Is that fair? Otherwise, they're going to be used more in a digestive role if they're taken with food.
Right.
And all the other supplements are taken with food. What kind of individual is capable of taking 180 to 200 supplements a day? What is the makeup of this individual? Because that sounds daunting, right? Right out the gate and all.
Well, I suppose. It doesn't sound daunting to me because I've been telling people to do this for years. I can't say that I've ever done that many myself, but I take supplements with my meals, and I take some away from meals. So I already do some to some extent. But what the person I would say is a motivated person, and I try my best to be sure that people know what they're getting into before they come into my office. So these days, it's relatively rare that somebody's jaw drops when I tell them what to do.
Okay.
Most of the time, actually, a lot of the time, I find that people have placed themselves on a more restrictive diet than what I tell them to do.
Okay.
And the supplements is what they expected because we tried our best to inform them before the appointment.
Okay. So for some of them, they're actually happy to meet with you because you're going to adjust the diet and it's going to get a little bit more liberal, I guess, some freedom there. And they were already expecting the supplement part. So it's okay. Okay. Now, you and I had a remote podcast where we talked about the coffee enemas.
Right.
So we won't dive in too deep, but coffee enemas is a part of this protocol.
Right.
And did that begin with Dr. Kelley? Was it? As far as this protocol, or did Dr. Beard discover that coffee enemas was a thing for this, or who?
Where did coffee enemas come from?
Well, yes, but more specifically for the cancer. Why did Kelley start doing it? Right? I'm just curious.
Well, just going back to Dr. Kelley's story, first he changed his diet and he stabilized. He wasn't getting better, but he wasn't getting worse. Then he started taking a lot of enzymes and noticed the character of the tumor started to change. But then he got sick. And he started to feel nausea, fatigue, just general flu-like symptoms. He just felt unwell. And it eventually got to the point where he couldn't take his enzymes, so he stopped them. And then the symptoms cleared up. But then almost as soon as he went back on them again, he started feeling bad again. And so what he came to realize was that it was tumor waste, and he thought about how to get rid of those, how to help the process along. And somehow he came up with the idea of coffee enemas. Now, he claimed that he found found the idea in the Merck Manual, which is a perpetually updated medical textbook. It's only available digitally now, but it included coffee enemas until the mid-1970s. But it turns out, of course, people who are familiar with the Gerson program know that Dr. Max Gerson recommended coffee enemas. Coffee enemas, as it turns out, with the advent of Google Books and the like, I've been able to find references for them going back to the mid-1800s. They've been around for a while.
Okay. Got it. So Kelley, because he's not feeling well and the tumors are breaking down, I guess is a way to put it, maybe making him feel sick.
He concluded that the tumors were breaking down and those breakdown products were making him sick.
Okay. And it's got to come out of the body. Yeah. And this is important because when we think of tumors in conventional oncology, a person goes and gets chemotherapy and the tumor shrinks. We have to ask the question, well, where did the tumor go? Where's that material that made up the tumor, right? It's still in the body somewhere, I guess. It needs to get expelled, through a bowel movement or through your urine, et cetera. But Kelley decides, I'm going to incorporate a coffee enema, see if this relieves the way I'm feeling, I suppose.
Right.
And he does it, and it provides relief. Is that what happens to him?
Yeah, he felt tremendously better. And I can tell you that almost without exception, the patients that come to see me and start doing coffee enemas say the way they feel after they do them is tremendously better. It becomes their favorite part of the protocol. And that is almost without exception. They're like, oh, yeah, the coffee enemas, they're great. That's what they say. Nobody wants to try it. I didn't want to try it when I first heard about them.
Right.
But they make people feel much, much better.
I can imagine. So, yeah, we're not drinking coffee. We're using it in an enema, folks, to remove the load. Oh, okay.
And as long as we're at it, I mean, people will say, oh, maybe it's a caffeine high. Like somehow you absorb so much more and you just get a buzz.
Right.
Well, it turns out that some investigators in Thailand, I don't know why they decided to do this, but they did a study. And they took some folks and they, on one day they would give them coffee to drink with a certain amount of caffeine and a certain amount of liquid, and they drink the coffee, and then they check their blood levels of caffeine afterwards. And then they had them use the same amount of caffeine as a coffee enema on another day, and they check the blood levels. And it turns out that with the same amount of caffeine, you might start absorbing it a little faster by the rectal route, but the peak is much, much lower. And in fact, the highest blood level you get is much lower than when you drink it. So it's not a caffeine high.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. So has the coffee enemas always been a component of the protocol since you began using it in 1993? Has it always been?
Yes.
Okay.
It was part of Dr. Kelley's work and, absolutely critical from what he said. And so when we set out to, in effect, recreate what Dr. Kelley was doing, of course we incorporated it because it was something that he said was critically important.
Right.
And so we've continued to do so.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. So that's really not, I would assume that's the entire protocol. We're looking at diagnosis to determine the autonomic nervous system, patient's parasympathetic or sympathetic. From there, we put them on a particular diet. From there, we incorporate a number of pancreatic enzymes to address cancer, pancreatic enzymes that are being taken away from meals. And then we're also incorporating some other supplements and some glandulars for overall health and wellness. And then we're also doing coffee enemas to get rid of, we'll say, cancer waste, among other things, but keeping those bowel movements going, right? Is that fair?
Yeah, the coffee enemas certainly move stool out of the body, but that's not really their main benefit.
Okay.
What we believe is that they're stimulating bile flow from the liver.
Okay.
And that works because the caffeine and other stuff can get absorbed across the wall of the intestine and get into the bloodstream. And the bloodstream around the colon goes straight up to the liver where it can do its work.
Got it.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. So detoxifying the liver.
Right. Yes. And, sometimes I'll have a patient that will say, well, I have regular bowel movements. I don't need to do the coffee enemas. And that means they're missing the point of what the enemas actually do.
Okay.
And usually what happens then is those patients will start developing aches and pains and general flu-like symptoms while they're taking all those enzymes. And so what I usually do is I say, can you give me 3 weeks? 3 weeks where you do the coffee enemas the way I told you to do and see how you feel. And invariably that settles it. They're fans.
Done. Okay. They become converts at that point.
Right.
All right. How long have you personally been doing coffee enemas for?
Since 1985.
And why did you start doing them?
Well, what I kind of left out in the course of that story is that I developed a fatigue syndrome when I was in medical school. So I guess in 1982, this is a common enough story. I guess I got a flu, a cold or a virus, and I just never felt the same afterwards. And my health started to go gradually downhill. So by the time I finished my medical internship in 1986, I was, brain fog and fatigue and just generally felt horrible. So I actually went on the Kelley program to get better, and I did.
The whole protocol?
Well, I didn't take a lot of enzymes because that wouldn't have been part of it for fatigue syndrome. But the detoxification was definitely key for me. Part of the reason I believe that I got sick, well, 2 things. Both of my parents were heavy smokers, so I spent the first 19 years of my life pickled in cigarette smoke. But when I was a pre-med student, the last couple of years of college, I worked in a biochemistry lab, and I was very careless with chemicals. So I actually wound up with a fair amount of one particular chemical. It's called beta-mercaptoethanol, and it has a very distinctive smell. It smells kind of like rotten eggs, and it has a chemical nature that's rather similar to what's used to straighten or curl hair, like permanent waves. So years later, when I went on the Kelley program to get well, and so I was taking, glandulars and supplements and doing the coffee enemas and other things, I had periods where I could smell, and so could everybody else, that chemical coming out of my body. And I had a period where my hair changed texture. It became very kind of almost kinky and brittle.
Really?
Well, during that period when the smell was coming out.
Whoa.
And then over, a few months, years, I forget how long it took, but eventually that went away and my hair went back to its usual nature. So
what was the name of this chemical that you got in your body?
Beta-mercaptoethanol.
What is it used for? Why were you using it?
Well, it's actually something, I was talking about permanent waves. In protein structure, there are times that 2 sulfur-containing molecules will connect, form a bridge. And permanent waves use something like beta-mercaptoethanol to break that bond. It was used in the particular biochemical thing that I was doing because the protein we were trying to isolate had a bond like that. So you would pour it through a column, it's called. You pour it through something, a gel, and it would attach to the column with that bond. But then you'd use beta-mercaptoethanol to knock it off again.
Was it getting on your skin?
Yeah.
Were you just breathing it?
Well, we were using something to help break that bond, so to speak. And I would be, I shouldn't have been doing it, but I was actually putting my hand in this liquid all the time.
Oh.
So it was really stupid of me.
Dr. Isaacs.
I don't blame my professor. I blame myself. But I was 19 years old and I was immortal. What can I say?
Right.
Yeah.
And so from the negative side effects from this chemical exposure, you start doing coffee enemas later.
Right.
Like at what age do you
well, I started doing them when I started my medical internship in 1985.
Okay.
And I started them not because quite frankly, I don't know that I even believed that they would make me feel better.
Right.
But I was just desperate. I
Okay.
felt horrible.
So you were skeptical, but you were sick.
I was skeptical but sick.
Wow.
And so I tried it and I felt so much better. And, bear in mind, I was doing my internship. So that meant that on many days when I went into the hospital at 8 in the morning, I was not coming out until 6 o'clock the next day. Sleep was a desperate commodity, but I was willing to get up 45 minutes earlier to do my coffee enemas because it made me feel so much better. And then
So you were doing a coffee enema every day in the morning before
every
work?
day in the morning before work.
Wow.
Yeah, and so then when 1986 came, and I had finished my internship. Fortunately, even though I felt terrible, I'm pleased to report I did not hurt anybody during that year that I know of. I really don't think I did.
Yeah.
God knows they would have told me.
Yeah.
So I finished my internship. Nick had actually finished. He was working on an immunology fellowship and finishing up his work on the whole Kelley project. And then from there, we went to stay with Dr. Kelley for a while. And so that's when I really buckled down and was doing quite a lot of coffee enemas and detox.
Wow.
Yeah.
And how long did it take before all the side effects from that chemical were gone, where you just felt like I'm beyond that now?
It took 2 or 3 years total for me to feel well enough to go back and finish my residency. I don't really remember the exact time frame.
Okay.
I know that the supplements that we had available weren't really as good as what I think I have now.
Right.
So it might have taken a little extra time.
Okay. Okay.
Yeah.
But you still continue to do the coffee enemas to this day.
Yes.
You're just a convert.
I feel better.
I feel better. Okay.
And I know some of my patients have told me, they say their family members will say, "You're just addicted to those coffee enemas." And my response to that is, I'm addicted to feeling better.
Yeah.
I'm addicted to feeling well.
Yeah.
And while I don't absolutely have to do them every day at this point, I feel better if I do.
That's great.
We live in a toxic world. That's just the reality. We're surrounded by chemicals that didn't exist 100 years ago, and I don't think we're biologically suited to live in the world we're in.
Good point.
Anything that helps.
Offset it.
I remember, I don't even remember what it was called. There's this woman named Megan Smith. Anyway, there was she had gone around interviewing various people, including me. I can dig up her information if you find that you're interested, but she had interviewed various people and she wound up putting together like a movie about alternative therapy. And she was somebody whose husband had died, and he died kind of right around the time that they realized alternatives existed, as I recall. And so she was just really angry, and so she interviewed me, but she also interviewed somebody at the NCI, and she had said something about detoxification to him, and his answer was, "What toxins?" What are these toxins? In other words, that the word detoxification means that we should be specifying what the toxins are in order to justify that phrase. But what I realized as I was digging around in the medical literature a bit from, bear in mind that what Kelley was doing was based on work, say, like Dr. Pottenger, who's then based on older literature. And the word toxemia or toxin has actually modified its meaning to a certain extent. Because in the early part of the 1900s, they would describe somebody who was just simply not feeling well, or like somebody sick with pneumonia, for example, you would say that they look toxic.
Oh, really?
And that word is still used to some extent now, but not nearly as much as it was before. But like there's a condition called preeclampsia or eclampsia in pregnancy. That used to be called toxemia of pregnancy. But they got away from toxemia because the implication, what's the toxin? So now they just simply call it something different.
Okay.
But what happens if a patient were to faithfully swallow all the enzymes but not do the coffee enemas is that they start to get flu-like symptoms. And it's almost like a low-grade version of the cytokine storm, that you might have heard about with COVID or with immunotherapy, where the body just creates a massive inflammatory response. And that syndrome would have been called in the early 1900s or even in the 19th century toxemia, but now it's called something different. But the phrase detoxification is left over from the old terminology of toxemia, in other words. So when you say what toxin, well, it's really a reflection on a poor choice of words for what I do. Detoxification, I still say it, but it's more a de-inflammatory. I can't even pronounce it, but to say it's somehow or other dealing with the issues that cause an intense inflammatory state that makes people feel like they've got the flu.
Right. Yeah, it's about getting rid of the debris in the body that makes you sick.
Yeah.
And if you're killing cancer cells, there has to be debris. I mean, there's trash that has to come out of the body.
Yeah, something has to happen to that.
Yeah.
And, in the setting of chemotherapy, when it works, bear in mind that also the patient is just desperately ill. They're sick, they're throwing up, they're having diarrhea. In the process of all of that, they can also be getting rid of those tumor waves. I mean, it's the same, like, for instance, if somebody develops gangrene, so their foot has lost circulation and you've got a bunch of dead tissue, they start to become systemically ill. So why, if you're killing off a tumor, wouldn't you get that same kind of systemic illness?
Right. I would think so.
Yeah,
I would think so.
And, I personally believe that if the immunotherapy people would just try a few coffee enemas, people would feel a whole lot better. But that will wait for another day, I guess.
And I would presume, but I don't know, that in combination with that, drinking a lot of water, I guess, to clear out your kidneys, your liver, to just drink a lot of water during this process would be really important as well.
Yeah, well, we recommend that people drink a fair amount of water. One thing about taking multiple doses of pancreas is you get plenty of water down that way.
Right.
So patients do get some water down.
Right. Okay. What isn't it the term as far as for tumor die-off? Is it tumor lysis? Is that the term? Tumor lysis.
Yeah, tumor lysis in the medical world is a much more exaggerated version of what I'm talking about.
Oh, it's worse.
So,
okay.
Yeah, it's much worse. I mean, that's where tumor dies off in a very dramatic way, and then the metabolic poisons can shut down the kidneys or do a lot of different things.
Okay.
So
you can kill. Am I hearing you correctly? You can kill a tumor too fast. Is that?
Yes, but with the work that I do, that isn't going to be an issue.
Right, okay.
But with chemotherapy, it can be, because chemo is administered IV, so the patient's body isn't in a position to say, stop, you're killing me.
Right.
With what I do, what will happen well before people would get to that point is that they would start to feel nausea, and then they just wouldn't be able to get their enzymes down. And that's actually what happened to Dr. Kelley, going back to his story, that he started to feel so sick that he couldn't get his enzymes down. His body forced him to take a break. And so then he started incorporating coffee enemas, and he didn't have to take those breaks anymore for that reason.
Got it. We talked about a lot, but it's very concise. Now, just in speaking with you today regarding this protocol, it's like, why not give it a shot? It's so simple. What have you got to lose by giving this a shot is how I see it. I mean, you have to eat every day, so you make an adjustment to how you eat. Okay.
Mhm.
Coffee enema sure is new. Taking all the supplements is new. But the pancreatic enzymes, the science behind that is like, wow.
Mhm.
I mean, that's a very compelling thing. I'm like, that's persuasive. I mean, I got to give that a shot.
Mhm.
And even the coffee enema is like, it's going to make me feel better as I'm getting rid of this trash. I'm like, yeah, what do I got to lose here? I don't have anything to lose. I just see upside. I might as well give it a shot.
Do you want to talk about the concept of pseudo-progression? Are you familiar with that?
Talk to me about pseudo-progression, Dr. Isaacs. What is pseudo-progression?
All right. One of the challenges with this particular approach is that sometimes tumor masses can get worse before they get better. And you may have heard of this with other alternative practitioners, but the reason we believe for that is that as the enzymes do their work on a cancer and turn live cells into dead cells, that's going to create an inflammatory reaction from the body. And white cells and inflammatory cells will come to the area to try to break those dead things up and get them out. But a CAT scan or an ultrasound or an imaging test cannot tell the difference. All it knows is that there's say, for example, a mass in the liver. All it knows is that there's something there that isn't the same consistency as the normal liver around it. That's all it knows. So it doesn't know whether it's a tumor or an inflamed tumor or a dead tumor. I mean, sometimes they can tell a difference, but many times they can't. And an illustration of that is actually a patient of mine, and I use his story in lectures, even though it's a little bit convoluted. But I suppose the bottom line is that he started treatment with me because there was a mass in his liver. Okay. And he, after about 4 months on the treatment, the mass had actually been removed, okay? And then he came in to see me, and then he went and got a CAT scan 3 months after he started with me, and the mass in his liver had regrown at some point in the 6 months from the last surgery and then the new scan. He'd only started with me halfway through that process.
Okay.
And then he also had a new mass on his lung. Okay. So this is all from colon cancer originally. Okay. So he was told, what you need to do is we're going to do another operation and take out that liver mass. And then we're going to do another operation and take out the lung mass. And then you're going to go back on chemotherapy. His original liver tumor had actually grown while he was on chemotherapy, so it hadn't seemed to work all that well. But nonetheless, they said, you're going to have to go back on chemo. And so he called me up and said, what do you think? And I said, well, I could tell he kind of needed to go ahead with the liver procedure. I said, go ahead and get the liver tumor out and let's see what it looks like. So they took it out, and the pathologist said, metastatic adenocarcinoma, no viable tumor seen. So what they said was that, yes, it looked like it was cancer, but it was also dead. So in other words, that mass had shown up, and the enzymes presumably had done a number on those cells, but his body was still trying to figure out how to get that out.
What to do with this mass?
What to do with it, exactly.
Really an inflamed mass. Okay.
But what it means on a practical level for patients on the program is that sometimes it can be very hard initially to figure out what's going on. And if people are too fixated on shrinking tumor masses as opposed to how they're feeling and functioning overall, then they may give up too early. Another example, a patient of Dr. Gonzalez's, whose story is told in the case report series that we had published. But he was a gentleman who had been diagnosed, I believe it was 1991, I think. He had been found to have a mass in his lungs, a mass in his pancreas, and 4 masses in his liver.
Mm.
Now, for some reason, they decided that it was easiest to take out the lung mass. And so there was a little confusion about whether it was lung cancer that spread to the pancreas and liver or pancreas cancer that spread to the liver and the lung. But it doesn't really matter because the prognosis rather for either is pretty bad. So he was told that he had 3 months to live. He came to see Dr. Gonzalez, and 2 years after he started, he had another scan, and he had a tumor in his pancreas and 4 tumors in his liver. Looked about the same. But he was alive, and he should have been dead, so he didn't worry about it too much. And it wasn't until a scan something like 7 years later that those masses had actually gone away.
Wow. 7 years later, okay.
Another patient of mine, a patient with pancreatic cancer, biopsy proven and everything, she was diagnosed in December of the year 2000. She started with me in April of 2001. Okay, so 4 months later. And she unfortunately did pass away in December of 2023. So that is, we're talking more than 20 years after a diagnosis that 20 months would be astonishing and 20 weeks would be more typical. She had 1 or 2 scans in between, but they still showed a mass in the pancreas. It had, the last one that she had, the mass had calcified, so it had obviously changed its character, but she was alive and she should have been dead. But that's what we see sometimes. Now, the phrase pseudo-progression has come into the medical consciousness because of the new immunotherapy drugs. Because what they see sometimes with immunotherapy is that the idea behind immunotherapy is to knock out some of the regulatory mechanisms on the immune system. So in effect, the immune system goes crazy and it attacks the cancer and knocks out the cancer. But sometimes what they see with immunotherapy is that initially it gets worse before it gets better because a whole lot of white cells and things rush to the area and it gets inflamed and puffy and irritated. Same phenomenon we've been describing for 30 years and Kelley for another 20 before us. But now it's become recognized because of this new therapy, immunotherapy.
So really it's a process where the tumor is dying, but it's inflaming.
Yes.
And
it's dying, but it's inflamed.
Inflaming because of the white cells and the way the body's responding to this dead piece of material now.
Right.
Like, what do we do with this? And but you're talking about case.
Another comparison in a way. Suppose you go on one of your ultra marathon things, and you bang up your knee in the process, and your knee swells up to 3 times its usual size. Well, that's not because you have a tumor in your knee.
Right.
It's because you've got an inflammatory process in your knee.
Right.
So inflammation can cause swelling.
Right.
And a tumor mass that's your body's responded to with a massive immune response can become swollen, and that will show up on a scan.
Interesting. And as you mentioned, a patient of yours that the tumor stayed there for up to 7 years before they actually were gone, like in an image, right? I mean, they were still there 3 years later. They might have been dead, but they were there. That, I guess for the layperson, that always concerns us, right? We're like, well, I still got the tumor though, but there is a difference between an active cancerous tumor versus a dead one that is not living anymore. It's not spreading anymore. It's there, but then the whole idea that a few years later, like in the case of this one patient you mentioned, then they're gone. Then the tumors are actually gone after a period of 7 years, I think is what you mentioned. That's amazing. That's amazing. But it also speaks to the reality that, we were talking about this earlier, that convenience and that whole microwave oven attitude of healthcare is a liability. It's not really good to think that way about health, that the good, stable health takes more time. You have to give things time to work themselves out if you're actively participating and getting better. Yeah, you mentioned ultra running or what have you. And I remember earlier this year, or much earlier, it was like in the month of February, I participated in an event and I sprained my ankle in the first 30 minutes, and I was slated to be doing it for 6 hours or whatever. And sprained my ankle. I still did it. I hobbled is what I did. But my ankle wasn't completely healed, I think, until August. So it happened in February, but my ankle wasn't completely healed until August. Like until I had full mobility, I was pain-free. And that's a long time. It's a long time for me. I wish it would just get better in, a month or two, really. But ultimately, I'm glad it's better and that it's healed. And that's an ankle. And now we're talking about cancers and tumors and all of this type of thing. And that, hey, it could take longer, for something to resolve. But it's good to be reminded about this from a doctor like yourself, from a medical doctor, to hear it again, because we need to hear it again and again, I think.
Yeah.
Especially in the time period that we live in today, where everything's a quick fix. We want everything very fast. That's just that's a lie, in my opinion. We can't have everything fast.
Right.
Things that take time to develop are normally stronger, and they're better suited for the difficulties, of life, when they've taken time to be developed and grown. So that's helpful. Thank you.
Yeah, I suppose one of the interesting things, I'm just kind of rambling at this point, but one of the things that I hear fairly often from patients is that, they go see their doctor and their doctor will say, your cancer is extraordinarily well behaved. I hear that all the time.
Really?
I just got it the other day. I have a patient right now who actually has an extremely supportive integrative oncologist, who has a long track record in the type of cancer that she has. And so he's able to look at her and say, the way you feel and the way you look does not match your tumor marker test.
Wow.
So let's just go with how you feel and how you look.
Wow.
And stay the course.
So here's an oncologist that is doing the blood labs and says, yeah, you still got this, but on the blood lab, but the way you're presenting, your overall health and wellness and is incredible. It's so positive.
So that's like a really rare thing. But, I guess what I'm thinking of, a patient who I'm trying to think when I first saw her. She had a very, very aggressive lymphoma, and that's a cancer of the immune system. And those types of cancer vary all the way from some that are so slow growing that you could easily die of something else before it have ever affected you, all the way to some that are super aggressive and move really fast.
Right.
So this woman had one of the super aggressive kind, and it's called a double hit diffuse large B-cell lymphoma. So the double hit meaning that she had 2 different genetic mutations of some kind or other that are supposed to go along with very poor prognosis. So she, at the time of her diagnosis, went from 1 month she was up and around and living her normal life. And 6 weeks later, she was in the hospital in the ICU, so desperately ill that she really had no choice but to go ahead with the chemo, because that was what was going to stabilize her in the short run. And then they told her, once she was stable, they told her, now what you need to do is a bone marrow transplant. So that would involve extra chemo that would, and possibly radiation that would basically knock out her entire immune system. And then they either replace her own immune system with the bad cells filtered out, or somebody else's immune system to replace that bone marrow. And she said, no, thank you. And instead she came to see me. And she's still with us. She's continues to look pretty good.
How many years now?
Oh gosh, 8 or 9,
Yeah.
maybe 10.
Wow.
Again, I lost track of when she first came in. But in the meantime, I actually looked up information about her condition and that diagnosis to see if indeed she absolutely had to get the bone marrow transplant, because I was thinking, hey, I can write her case up. And what I found was that about half the time, apparently, the chemo that she had actually is sufficient. So I never actually wrote up her case. But in the meantime, she, in a social situation, encountered a hematologist oncologist from one of the big institutions in Boston. And he listened to her story, and then he told her, you couldn't possibly have really had that diagnosis because you shouldn't be here. So he was saying, well, you're completely wrong in what you had because you didn't have it because you couldn't have had it.
Right. Yeah, because you shouldn't be here anymore.
Yeah, you shouldn't be here anymore.
Yeah.
And it's so funny that the patients will sometimes get that reaction. Well, you didn't really have that.
Yeah.
And it's like, well, yes, I did. I have the paperwork.
Right, exactly.
Well, it was a mistaken diagnosis. Yeah. Well, then there's something really bad with the medical system that somebody gave me this piece of paper.
It's like mass psychosis on the part of the doctor. Sometimes they're just locked in. It's like, no, it's not possible. It's not possible. It doesn't fit the paradigm, right?
Yeah. This is outside my experience, so I don't want to look at it because then I'll have to change my life.
Right. It's wild. It's totally wild. So, Dr. Isaacs,
she thought it was funny. So
yeah, I mean, it's because she's still alive, right? Thank God, and she's doing well, so that's good. So, you're not the kind of doctor. You've never been the kind of doctor that is going to sell patients on, come do this particular protocol if you have cancer. It's not what you do. It's never been what you do. But for myself, as I've gone through all this with you today, I'm like, everybody needs to give this a shot, or everyone needs to at least consider this. This is really important. But you're the living authority on this topic. You've been doing this for over 30 years now. You've seen the patients, the good, the bad, and the ugly. You've seen it all. Please, for everyone listening to this, why should they consider this as a first option?
I think that everyone with that cancer diagnosis should start off by talking to their oncologist and finding out what they have and what can be done about it. But they need to ask a lot of questions because the oncologist, I believe, with the best will in the world, I'm not saying that they're evil or that they're motivated by nothing but money or anything like that, but they are motivated to make their treatment sound as good as possible because they genuinely believe that what they're offering is the best thing that you can do. And in some cases, I think it is the best thing you can do. If somebody has a surgically manageable cancer, I would say, go ahead, do it. Because this type of approach requires consistent adherence for years. So not everybody gets into it and finds that they can do that. And if in the meantime they had turned down a surgery that could have cured them, or for that matter, chemo that could have cured them in those situations where it could have, then I would feel terrible about it. And so if it's surgically resectable, do it. Okay. If orthodox therapy has a treatment for you that is that effective, do it. If they start throwing around phrases like treatable but not curable, or treatable and they never use the word curable, start asking questions. And that's where you may decide, the cancer patient may decide that the treatment is not worth the toxicity. Or the treatment isn't worth anything because it just doesn't work very well. And they do, they will say things like, I'm thinking of pancreatic cancer specifically here, but there will be things like, if you don't take this treatment, you're going to be dead in 3 months. They forget to mention that if you do take the treatment, you're going to be dead in 6 months because the treatment doesn't offer immortality. It offers a few extra months. And if you don't ask, they won't tell you. So that's the first thing I would say to do. The second consideration really is, like I said, this requires consistent adherence for years. So you can't have a bad day and decide that you're going to eat chocolate cake all day. You have to be consistent. You can't decide that you're going to go to the family reunion and eat everything that's there. And admittedly, once a year is probably not that big a deal, but there will be some patients that will decide that they're going to be good 5 days a week and blow it all on the weekend. That's not going to work. And people have to understand why and truly believe it, or they're not going to follow through. And so, that's part of why, I have screening mechanisms. It's part of why I explain it all on my website. It's why I'm happy to explain it to you so you can show it to other people. Because, it's a waste of everybody's time if somebody comes to see me and then doesn't follow through. But so what does that mean? It requires commitment. It requires thinking about what is it that makes it important for you to stay on this earth. And then to remember that. And, I'm making this program sound like some sort of a grim burden. I really don't think it is. But there's a learning curve to get started, and then there's a maintenance progress. But, most of my patients are, I routinely have people end conversations with me for saying, thank you so much for making this available.
Nice. That's nice.
I get a lot of positive feedback like that as part of what keeps me going. But, people have to know that they're getting into a serious commitment and be willing to do that. For this to be a way to go. But having said that, I do it. I follow I do my own coffee enemas. I swallow my own pills. I make my own food. So I think it's absolutely worth it.
You practice what you preach. Question for you. You mentioned earlier about, the oncologist that is not freely telling the patient information. The patient has to ask them, right? Doctor's not telling them. They're explaining certain things to them. Why are doctors not explaining to patients things that maybe they should explain, right? Why don't doctors just come out and just say, hey, here's everything that you need to know, right?
Yeah.
Why is there information withheld? So it would seem.
Well, I think that the reasons can vary depending on the doctor. I do think that one thing that is an influence, unfortunately, is that the way medical care is compensated by insurance companies and the government is that you don't get paid for explaining things to people. The level of payment for just sitting down and talking with people is quite low. And explaining things takes time, and you're not given the time. Whereas administering chemotherapy or radiation or doing surgery, those services are compensated much better. So that is a problem, and in a way, it's a problem throughout the medical world because, people don't want to pay for information. So that's kind of a global issue. Another thing, it's an uncomfortable conversation to have, and one that you'd really rather not have. And then also, I believe that the doctors that are administering a treatment that may only prolong life for an extra 6 months, they still believe that they're offering a valuable service. They still believe it's in the best interest of the patient to do it. They're very sincere about it. And you'll see headlines in the medical literature, like fabulous new breakthrough, and then you look at the article and it's like this medication in a highly selected group of patients prolonged life by 2 months, and you're kind of like highly impressive breakthrough product, and you're kind of like, what?
2 months.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. No. Yeah.
But anyway, so I do believe that a lot of them are quite sincere about what they're doing. I don't think that very many of them are motivated purely by money. But at the same time, I don't remember who I'm quoting on this, but the line that it's hard to convince someone of something if their salary depends on believing the opposite. Yeah,
Yeah, it's tough.
it's tough.
Yeah, it's pretty tough. Yeah. Wow. That's tough. So, Dr. Isaacs, we ask every guest that we have to ask a question of our next guest. So here's the question for you.
Okay.
If you had unlimited authority, how would you use it?
Unlimited authority. Gosh.
As a medical doctor. As a medical doctor specifically, how would you use it?
Unlimited authority. Well, I mean, look, the things that I've been thinking about lately would be the opportunity to do testing on the various aspects of what I do. Not only to give it more validation in terms of patients, but also to encourage more physicians to actually use it. So, just as a quick example, coffee enemas, I believe that they operate by helping the body to clear cytokines, the cytokine storm. And I can think of a way to test that, but I would need money, because that would require laboratory testing, and I wouldn't want people to be volunteering to do that. But I also would need authority in the sense of getting it through whatever regulations. But for example, I think coffee enemas would be fabulous for the brain fog that frequently plagues people after they finish their treatment. And I think that could be a tremendous source of help for a problem that is very burdensome for the people that are dealing with it. I also think that pancreatic enzymes might be very beneficial to help immunotherapy work better. That there may be some synergy there. So I have some ideas, but again, it would take money, and it would take the personnel, and it would take the regulatory approval. So that's the kind of things I think about, I daydream about. And certainly unlimited authority would help me do all of that.
Yeah, it would. Yeah, it would. That would make, if I was in your shoes, that would make me happy. Let's get it done. How quick can we get it done?
Exactly.
Yeah, that's great. Dr. Linda, I just want to say thank you for spending all this time with us in studio today. If patients want to reach out to you, find out about possibly becoming a new patient with you, what's the best way for them to reach you?
I would suggest they visit my website, which is www.drlindai.com. Again, www.drlindai.com. And there they will find information about what I do. They will find directions on what to do if they do decide they want to become a patient, because I'd like for them to send in information about themselves so I can assess whether it's a good fit.
And for all the individuals listening or watching this, don't hesitate to sign up for Dr. Linda's newsletter. I receive it. It always has great, valuable content, and I think you would enjoy that as well. Thanks again, Dr. Linda. We appreciate the time that you spent with us today.
Well, thank you for the opportunity.